The stadium is empty now. That is the first truth, and the one we most often ignore. The roaring cascade of sound, the 60,000 voices fused into a single, trembling note of hope or fury, has vanished. It leaves behind a vacuum, a silence so profound it has its own weight. You can hear the wind snaking through the upper deck, carrying a hot dog wrapper across a lonely patch of artificial turf. A bank of lights high above hums with a dying electrical current. This is the cathedral after the congregation has left, and what remains is not glory, but geometry. The stark lines of the field, the brutalist architecture of the stands, the cold aluminum benches. This is where the story actually lives, in this echo. Not in the highlight reel, but in the hollowed-out quiet that follows it. Because while we were celebrating the spectacle, other things were being decided. Fates were being sealed in the language of torque and tissue, of neurons shearing under a force they were never meant to withstand. We cheered for the collision, and in the medical tent, a man's world was quietly, irrevocably narrowing. We talk about a player's final season. We mark it in the record books. The last game, the last touchdown, the last time he walked off the field and into retirement. But that is a statistic, a public event. There is another final season, a private one, that almost always comes earlier. It is the last season he was himself. The last season he recognized his children's voices without a filter of fog. The last season he could navigate a grocery store without a rising tide of panic. The last season his wife looked at him and saw the man she married, and not a familiar stranger prone to inexplicable rages or terrifying passivity. That final season passes without announcement. There is no jersey retirement, no tearful press conference. It is a border crossed in the dark, without signposts. One day he is on one side, and then he is not. He is in a new country, whose terrain is confusing, whose climate is chronic pain, and whose native language is regret. I think of Mike Webster. They called him Iron Mike, the anchor of the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty, a Hall of Fame center, the embodiment of blue-collar toughness. His final NFL game was in 1990. But his final season, the last one where Mike Webster was Mike Webster, likely ended years before. By the time he retired, the fabric of his mind was already fraying. He would later live out of his pickup truck, sleeping in train stations, using a taser to knock himself unconscious just to get a few hours of sleep to escape the chaos in his own head. The man who could recall every blocking scheme of a 20-year career could not remember how to get home. His final season had slipped away long ago, lost in a haze of subconcussive hits, 1,000 minor car crashes in a helmet. I think of Junior So, with his radiant, electric smile, the passionate leader, the friend to everyone, the player whose energy could lift an entire city. His final season in the NFL was 2009. But the man who shot himself in the chest in 2012, who deliberately preserved his brain for study, that man had been gone for a while. Friends spoke of a darkness they didn't recognize, a volatility that was not him. The laughter had died down, replaced by a silent, internal storm. His final season, the last one of pure, unfiltered Junior, was a memory before the gunshot ever echoed. I think of the nameless ones, the legion of men who never made a Pro Bowl but who absorbed the same hits, who internalized the same code. The man who sits in his suburban living room, the television flickering with a game he can no longer bear to watch, because the sound of the pads cracking is a trigger that sends jolts of phantom pain through his own ruined knees and back. He is there, but he is not. He left a part of himself, the best part, on a practice field in August or on a meaningless down in a blowout game. His final season was the one before the first major surgery, before the first time a doctor looked at an MRI and shook his head slowly, before the first time he had to ask his child to speak up because his ears rang with a perpetual, high-pitched scream from a block he threw in 1997. How did we get here? This is the haunting, central question. It is not a question of physics, though physics is the mechanism. It is not merely a question of medicine, though medicine holds the grim autopsy reports. It is a question of culture, of story. We built a myth so powerful, so seductive, that it blinded us to the cost of its own fabrication. We crafted a hero archetype, the warrior who shrugs off pain, the gladiator who rises from the canvas, the Iron Man who never misses a snap, and we sold it to the boys who dreamed of being heroes. We sold it to them in newspaper columns, in slow-motion highlight films set to soaring music, in the gravelly voiced pronouncements of broadcasters who transformed traumatic brain injury into getting your bell rung. We coded self-destruction as valor. We framed a neurological disorder as a badge of honor. We celebrated the very thing that was destroying them, and we called it toughness. The contract was never written down, but every boy who laced up cleats understood it. In exchange for adulation, for glory, for a chance at immortality, you offered your body. You offered your mind. You agreed to treat pain not as a warning signal, but as a weakness to be conquered. You agreed to see your own physical breaking not as a tragedy, but as an inevitable and even noble sacrifice on the altar of Sunday. And we, the audience, the media, the league, we were the high priests of that altar. We wrote the hymns. We lit the incense. We anointed the sacrifices. We turned the screws of the culture that told them to walk it off, to shake it off, to get back in there. So when we wonder how a Mike Webster ends up alone and confused, how a junior so is found dead by his own hand, we cannot simply point to the game. We must point to the ecosystem that surrounded it. We must look at the writers who coined the term bell rung with a wink. We must look at the coaches who preached that pain is temporary, film is forever, ignoring the fact that some pain is permanent and some damage doesn't show up on film. We must look at the broadcast partners who packaged big hits as entertainment, who created montages set to heavy metal music, who turned the potential for catastrophic injury into a weekly jacked up segment. We must look at ourselves for cheering loudest when a man did not get up. This is not about assigning simple blame. It is about tracing a legacy. It is about understanding how a celebration of physical courage curdled, slowly and inexorably, into a cult of mandatory self-harm. The players were not passive victims. They bought into the myth, they weaponized it, they used it against each other. Could he play? Was the only question that mattered. The answer was almost always yes, even when it should have been a scream of no. They were agents of their own destruction, yes, but they were acting from a script we all helped write. A script that told them their worth was measured in snaps played through injury, in concussions hidden, in pain denied. The empty stadium holds all of this. The silence is not just an absence of noise. It is the space where the echoes of those hits finally land. It is the aftermath of the story we told ourselves. We told a story of giants and warriors. We did not tell the story of the broken men left behind when the giants fell. We did not tell the story of the mornings after, when the adrenaline faded and only the damage remained. We did not tell the story of the final season, the one that ended in silence long before the career did. This documentary is that story. It is an excavation of the myth. It is a journey into the machine that took a game and turned it into a gladiatorial rite, that took young men and turned them into icons, and then, too often, into casualties. We celebrated the violence. Now, we must reckon with the cost. We must listen to the silence, and finally hear what it has been trying to tell us all along. The myth of football toughness is not a natural phenomenon. It did not spontaneously generate from the mud of early 20th century fields. It was not an inevitable byproduct of a contact sport. It was constructed. Carefully, deliberately, and over the course of a century, it was architected in the press box, scripted in the film room, amplified by the broadcast booth, and sold to the public as the ultimate testament to American character. This documentary is the story of that construction project. It is the story of how a set of brutal physical realities, concussion, fracture, dislocation, chronic pain, were systematically translated into a language of virtue. How damage became durability. How trauma became toughness. How a public spectacle became, for the men inside the uniforms, a private crisis with a very public script they were forced to follow. To understand the height of the myth, we must first visit its foundations. In the sport's rough, early decades, violence was a selling point, but it was raw, often framed as chaos or manly discord. The transformation began when narrative purpose was applied to that violence. Sports writers of the 1920s and 30s, men like Grantland Rice, were the first true mythmakers. They did not just report games. They framed them within epic American archetypes. Rice famously wrote of the 1924 Notre Dame backfield. Outlined against a blue-gray October sky, the four horsemen rode again. He wasn't describing athletes, he was conjuring biblical apocalypse. The language lifted the hit from the terrestrial to the symbolic. The player was no longer a man, but a horseman, a warrior, a titan. This established the crucial first principle. The football player exists within a legend, and within a legend, suffering is not pathology, it is pathos. A hurt titan is still a titan. His pain is merely proof of his monumental struggle. This narrative framework found its perfect governing philosophy in the post-war era, with the rise of coaches like Vince Lombardi. Lombardi's genius was motivational, but his words were often stripped of context and hardened into absolute, dangerous law. Winning isn't everything. It's the only thing. Fatigue makes cowards of us all. His ethos was about mental fortitude, but it was distilled and weaponized into a simple physical mandate. The greater your capacity to endure pain, the greater your worth to the team. The coach became the high priest of the new religion, and his locker room was the chapel where the doctrine of sacrifice was preached. The media eagerly anointed these priests, publishing their philosophies not as coaching strategies, but as moral codes. A player's relationship with pain was now a measure of his character, his loyalty, his very manhood. The institution of the NFL, sensing the potent marketability of this gladiatorial narrative, leaned in. It partnered with publishers, then networks, to ensure the story being told was the one that sold tickets and airtime. It was a story of war, not surgery, of heroes, not patience. Within this ecosystem, distinct factions operated, each playing a role in sustaining the myth. First, the players. They were the raw material, the living subjects of the story. They internalized the code, weaponized it against themselves and each other, and derived identity and status from it. Their language became the language of the myth. I got my bell rung. It's just a stinger. I'll tape it up. They were both the protagonists and the primary victims of the narrative they lived. Second, the media. This was the engine of dissemination. From the florid prose of newspaper columnists to the sonorous narration of NFL films to the excited shouts of television analysts, media translators took the complex, often grim reality of the sport and refined it into a potent, palatable myth. They provided the vocabulary and the emotional soundtrack. Third, the institution. The league office, the team front offices, the marketing arms. Their role was curation and amplification. They controlled access, produced their own mythic content, and managed crises that threatened the narrative. They sold the legend of the gladiator while simultaneously downplaying the blood in the sand. And finally, there was medicine, the silenced faction. Team doctors and independent researchers often found their warnings about the long-term cost of repeated trauma drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the demands of the season. Their science spoke of cumulative damage and permanent deficit. The myth spoke of valor and resilience. For decades, the myth was louder. We can hear the myth's foundation in the quotes that became catechism. Vince Lombardi's relentless declarations set the tone. But listen to others. Hemingway, though not a sports figure, captured the corrosive masculine ideal that football adopted, grace under pressure. It sounds noble until it becomes a mandate to play with a fractured vertebra. Listen to the legendary NFL film's narrator John Facenda, his voice like God narrating the creation of a battlefield. The quarterback is a target, a marked man in a crosshair. He didn't say a player in a sport. He said a target. The language is one of warfare, of life and death stakes, where injury is not an accident but an expected outcome of enemy action. Listen to the players themselves, like Hall of Fame linebacker Dick Butkus. I would never set out to injure anybody deliberately, unless it was, important like a league game. It's a joke, but it reveals the ingrained mindset. The league game is war, and in war, the normal rules of bodily sanctity are suspended. These phrases, repeated, celebrated, became the bricks in the wall. They built a culture where coming out of the game was an act of treason, and playing through injury was the ultimate act of loyalty. This documentary will deconstruct that wall, brick by historical brick. Our journey is chronological and thematic. We will begin at the very beginning with the creation of the lexicon itself, the words that made violence virtuous. We will move through the coaching philosophies that codified sacrifice and into the explosive marriage of football and television, which aestheticized the violent hit and brought it into America's living rooms as entertainment. We will examine the specific media machines, magazines, broadcast teams, the league's own film unit that became factories for the toughness myth. We will go inside the locker room to understand how players police the code amongst themselves, creating a culture of silence. We will confront the medical complicity and the decades-long denial of science. We will analyze specific case studies like the protracted battle over concussions to see how the myth actively fought truth. We will look at the economic engine that made toughness a currency and the generational transmission of the code from father to son. Finally, we will examine the fragile, uncertain reckoning of the modern era. The players who have become their own journalists, the media members struggling with a new vocabulary, and the unanswered question of whether a sport built on this myth can truly evolve beyond it. This is not an attempt to erase the genuine courage, the profound dedication, or the breathtaking skill that defines football at its best. Those things are real, but they have been entangled for too long with a cult of mandatory suffering. We celebrated the warrior without ever building a proper home for the veteran. We demanded everything they had to give, and then turned away when the bill for that demand came due. This series is an autopsy of a cultural narrative. It is an investigation into how we, as a society, tell stories about pain, about manhood, about value. And it is about the real human beings who had to live inside the story we wrote for them, long after the final chapter had, for us, ended. The stadium may be empty, but the echo is a conversation we can no longer afford to ignore. The story of toughness is a story we told. It is time to hear the story of the cost. The myth did not begin with a hit. It began with a word. It began in the clatter of typewriter keys in cramped, smoke-filled press boxes high above the fray, where men who would never take a snap translated the chaos below into narrative. Before film, before television, before the internet, there was the written word. And in the first half of the 20th century, a generation of sports writers, many of them drawing from the traditions of war correspondence and classical epic poetry, became the primary architects of football's reality. They did not just report what happened. They decided what it meant. And in doing so, they performed a profound alchemy. They took the sport's inherent violence and transformed it into virtue. They took young men from Ohio and Pennsylvania and Alabama and recast them as timeless archetypes. The Iron Man, the warrior, the gladiator, the titan. This was the birth of the lexicon. This was the moment the currency of toughness was minted, and its value was set not in the physical cost, but in the poetic payoff. To understand the power of this early framing, you must picture the landscape. Football in the 1920s and 30s was a brutal, rudimentary, and often deadly game. The forward pass was still a novelty. Strategy was often just mass momentum. Helmets were leather, padding was minimal, and the collision was the point. Dozens of young men died playing the sport in the early decades, a fact that spurred reform but also a perverse fascination. Into this arena stepped writers like Grantland Rice of the New York Herald Tribune. Rice was not a cynic, he was a romantic. He saw in football not just a game, but a stage for the enactment of timeless American ideals. Courage, sacrifice, and manhood forged in conflict. His famous lead on the 1924 Notre Dame backfield is the foundational text of the myth. He did not write, "Notre Dame's skilled runners won a game today." He wrote, "Outlined against a blue-gray October sky, the four horsemen rode again." In dramatic lore, they are known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. These are only aliases. Their real names are Stuldrier, Miller, Crowley, and Leyden. This is not sports reporting. This is the book of Revelation. With a few strokes of his typewriter, Rice lifted 4 college athletes from the mud of South Bend and placed them among the apocalyptic harbingers of myth. The message was explicit. This is not entertainment. This is epic. The players are not students. They are supernatural forces. And if they are horsemen of the apocalypse, then their violence is not merely permitted, it is divinely ordained, a necessary part of a grand, terrifying narrative. This rhetorical move was revolutionary. It established a template that would dominate football writing for a century. The player was no longer a human being with bones that could break and a brain that could bruise. He was a symbol. He was the galloping ghost, Red Grange, or the man in the brown suit, Johnny Mac Brown. He was Iron Mike or the Assassin or Concrete Charlie. These were not nicknames. They were narrative assignments. They told the player and the public who he was supposed to be. An Iron Man does not feel pain. He is impervious to it. A warrior does not retreat from battle due to injury. He fights until he can fight no more. A gladiator understands that the arena may claim his body, and that this sacrifice is his purpose. The language created a cage of expectation, beautifully gilded, from which there was no honorable exit except through total physical depletion. And what of the violence itself? The lexicon provided a soothing, even charming, vocabulary for catastrophe. This is where the true sleight of hand occurred. A concussion, a traumatic injury to the most complex organ in the human body, became getting your bell rung. The phrase is infantilizing, almost comic. It evokes a child bumping his head on a low porch, seeing stars, shaking it off with a grin. It suggests a temporary, harmless dissonance, a momentary clang that fades into silence. It hides the reality of sheared axons, of chemical cascades, of a brain scrambling to reboot under duress. A debilitating injury, a torn ligament, a fractured vertebra, a separated shoulder, was framed as playing through pain. The phrase is heroic. It places the emphasis on the act of playing, of perseverance, while marginalizing the pain as a mere obstacle, a test of will. It never asks, what is the source of the pain? Is it a warning signal of structural damage? Is it the body begging for repair? The lexicon refused these medical questions. Pain was not information. It was static to be ignored. The ultimate phrase, the one that sealed the contract, was "he's a football player." It was deployed as the final, unassailable argument. Can he go with that knee? He's a football player. The statement was presented as an identity, not a profession. It meant, his essence is to endure. To question his ability to play hurt was to question his very being. We can hear this lexicon echoing from the players themselves, who absorbed the language of their own mythologizers. Sammy Baugh, the legendary Washington quarterback, once said of a notoriously violent hit, "He just knocked the fudge out of me." The phrasing is deliberately quaint, a folksy euphemism for an event that likely involved a significant brain trauma. It deflects seriousness with humor. Hall of Fame linebacker Ray Nitschke spoke of the game in terms of controlled fury, of a mindset where injury was irrelevant. "You've got to be a beast," he said, fully embracing the animalistic archetype the writers had created for him. The coaches, too, became fluent in this language. They were the foremen on the factory floor of the myth, translating the poet's verses into daily practice. "You're hurt, you're not injured," became a common mantra. It was a linguistic trick that created a false binary. Hurt was acceptable, a state of mind. Injured was a medical condition that might excuse you. The player was thus placed in a perpetual double bind. To admit he was injured was to fail the test of toughness, to betray the archetype. So he stayed hurt, and he played. This early lexicon, forged in newsprint, did more than describe the game. Prescribed behavior, created a value system. The highest value was not health, not longevity, not even necessarily victory in every single game. The highest value was the visible, demonstrable capacity to withstand and dismiss your own physical suffering for the cause. It created a perverse economy where a player's toughness was a tangible asset, more immediately praised than his technique or his football intelligence. A guard who played on a broken ankle became a legend. A linebacker who returned to the field after losing consciousness was a hero. Their statistical contributions in those games might have been negligible, even detrimental to the team's chances, but that was irrelevant. They had contributed something purer, a story. They had embodied the myth, and the writers were there, their typewriters ready, to ensure that story was the one that survived, was cut into newspapers across the country, and was absorbed by the next generation of boys who dreamed of being horsemen, of being ghosts, of being Iron Men. The legacy of this leather-bound lexicon is a poisoned well. It taught us all fans, players, coaches, executives to speak about the human body in a language of metaphor that denied its biological reality. It taught us to aestheticize damage. It built a wall of words so high that the warning cries of medicine could not be heard over it for decades. When a doctor said concussion, the lexicon said bell rung. And the latter was so much easier to hear. It was familiar, it was folksy, it was tough. The language created a shared conspiracy of denial, one where everyone was complicit because everyone was speaking the same beautiful, destructive tongue. The foundation was laid not in the training room, but on the printed page. The blueprint for the gladiator was drawn not by an engineer, but by a poet. And once that language was in the bloodstream of the culture, the next step was to give it a voice, a face, and a soundtrack. The written word had created the legend. Now, a new medium would bring it to life and sell it to a nation. The lexicon provided the vocabulary, but vocabulary alone does not create doctrine. For that, you need a preacher. You need a voice of such unwavering conviction, such moral authority, that his words transcend strategy and become scripture. In the mid-20th century, football found its most influential preachers in a generation of coaching legends, and at their pulpit stood one man whose name itself became a synonym for the religion of football, Vincent Thomas Lombardi. His philosophy, a complex tapestry of discipline, detail, love, and relentless pursuit of excellence, would be ruthlessly distilled by the culture around him into a single dangerous mantra: sacrifice everything, especially your body, for the cause. Lombardi's gospel was about perfect execution. What the football world heard was a commandment for endless suffering. To understand the distortion, you must first understand the man and his true message. Lombardi was not a caricature. He was a deeply principled, fiercely passionate teacher. His core belief was in the transformative power of hard work and collective will. He famously said, "The quality of a person's life is in direct proportion to their commitment to excellence, regardless of their chosen field of endeavor." His focus was on effort, on leaving nothing ungiven in pursuit of a goal. Another cornerstone was mental toughness. He defined it not as the ability to play with a broken leg, but as humility, simplicity, Spartan-like qualities. It was about focus, resilience of spirit, and composure under pressure. And then there was the most famous and most misused Lombardiism. Winning isn't everything. It's the only thing. The quote is often stripped of its context. A fiery locker room speech meant to ignite immediate competitive fury and fossilized into a cold, absolute life principle. But even Lombardi wrestled with its reduction. He later lamented, "I wish to hell I'd never said the damn thing. I meant the effort. I meant having a goal. I sure as hell didn't mean for people to crush human values and morality." But the football ecosystem, already primed by the sports writer's heroic lexicon, was hungry for absolutism. It took Lombardi's nuanced, intense philosophy and sanded down the nuances, leaving only the hard, sharp edges that could be used as tools. Winning is the only thing was severed from the effort to win, and was interpreted as a utilitarian mandate. Any action that increased the chance of winning was justified. And what action was most readily available to every player, regardless of talent? The willing submission of his physical well-being. If winning is the only thing, then a body is merely a tool to achieve it. A broken tool is not a tragedy. It is a strategic loss. And a player who refused to be a broken tool was, by this twisted logic, prioritizing his own comfort over the sacred goal. The coach's approval became the ultimate validator of a player's worth. And since the coach's stated ultimate value was winning, the player's currency became his visible, tangible contribution to that end, which often meant his availability, which often meant playing hurt. This created the cult of the hard-nosed coach. Lombardi was the archetype, but he was joined by others: Bear Bryant at Alabama, Woody Hayes at Ohio State, Don Shula in Miami, men whose stern, often terrifying, exteriors projected an aura of infallible judgment. Their sideline scowls, their explosive tempers, were not seen as flaws but as evidence of their supreme commitment. They were the high priests of the toughness religion. Their practices, the infamous Junction Boys under Bryant, Lombardi's grueling two-a-days in the Green Bay heat, became legends of purification through suffering. To survive the coach ordeal was to be initiated into the brotherhood. And the central tenet of that brotherhood was this: the coach's judgment of your pain trumped your own. He decided if you were hurt or injured. He decided if you could go. His nod was absolution. His sidelining glance was excommunication. Players internalized this to an extreme degree. Jerry Kramer, Lombardi's own guard, wrote in his seminal book Instant Replay about playing with a grotesquely infected leg abscess that required constant draining, and about Lombardi's complex reaction, a mixture of admiration, concern, and expectation that he would play. Kramer played. He wrote, "You didn't want to let Coach Lombardi down." That sentiment, not letting the coach down, became a more powerful motivator than any fear of permanent damage. The coach's respect was the ultimate reward, and it was earned through demonstrable sacrifice. This dynamic placed medical staff in an impossible position. The team doctor or trainer worked for the coach, not the player. His job was not merely to safeguard health. It was to get players back on the field for the boss. The phrase "cleared to play" became a moral verdict as much as a medical one. To be cleared was to be worthy. To be held out was to be suspect. The media played a crucial role in sanctifying these coaches and codifying their distorted gospel. They portrayed them not as flawed men managing complex rosters, but as monolithic figures of wisdom and will. Biographies, magazine profiles, and television features focused on their stern methods and glorious results, implicitly endorsing the ends justify the means approach. A story about a player who received a pain-killing injection and played on a high ankle sprain to help his team win was framed as inspirational, not as a cautionary tale of medical risk. The coach who demanded such sacrifice was portrayed as a master motivator, extracting every last ounce of effort from his men. The potential long-term cost of that extracted ounce was never part of the narrative. The gospel, according to Lombardi, as filtered through the media, became a gospel of redemption through pain. The field was your cross, your injuries were your stigmata, and the coach was both your demanding God and your forgiving Father. This created a legacy that long outlasted the men themselves. Generations of younger coaches, who never knew Lombardi but knew his legend, adopted the caricature without the underlying compassion or complexity. They copied the stern demeanor, the explosive anger, the demand for total sacrifice, but often lacked the deep, familial loyalty Lombardi famously felt for his players. The gospel had been reduced to its most punitive verses. In high school locker rooms and college weight rooms across America, coaches paraphrased Lombardi, shouted about winning being the only thing, and created environments where reporting an injury was seen as soft, as letting the team down. The cultural poison had trickled down from the professional mountaintop to every level of the sport. The coach's whistle was the whistle of the foreman, and the product was victory. The human cost was classified as overhead. The tragic irony is that Lombardi's true message was one of empowerment through collective struggle. He believed in making men better. He said, "The spirit, the will to win, and the will to excel are the things that endure. These qualities are so much more important than the events that occur. But the events, the wins, the losses, the injuries are what we could see. The spirit was invisible." So, the culture latched onto the visible events and attached the spiritual language to them. Playing through a concussion wasn't just a medical mistake. It was an exhibition of the will to win. Destroying your knee for one more season wasn't just poor career management. It was a demonstration of the will to excel. The language of the soul was used to sanctify the destruction of the body. The gospel, according to Lombardi, therefore, stands as the great inflection point. It took the poetic archetypes created by the sports writers, warrior, gladiator, and gave them a rulebook and a priesthood. It provided a moral framework, however misinterpreted, that made sacrifice not just admirable but obligatory. It established the coach as the ultimate arbiter of a player's toughness, and thus his worth. The stadium was no longer just an arena. It was a church. The playbook was a liturgy, and the price of discipleship was written in torn ligaments and bruised brains. With this theological framework firmly in place, the religion was ready for its next, most powerful phase: amplification. The gospel had been written and preached. Now, it was time to build a cathedral for it in every living room in America. The preacher had done his work. Now, the televangelists were coming. The gospel had been written in the newsprint and preached from the locker room pulpit. But it reached its apotheosis, its most powerful and pervasive form, through a glowing box in the American living room. Television didn't just broadcast football, it transmuted it. It took the raw materials of the sport, the strategy, the athleticism, the violence, and through the alchemy of the camera lens, the slow-motion replay, and the commentary booth, it produced a new, intoxicating product. Football as cinematic epic, where pain was not a consequence but a plot point, and where the violent hit was the most celebrated special effect. Television built the cathedral for the religion of toughness, and it made parishioners of us all. The transformation began not with the live game broadcast, but with the league's own myth-making arm, NFL Films. Founded in the 1960s by Ed Sabol and his son Steve, NFL Films wasn't a documentary unit. It was a Hollywood studio for football. They revolutionized how the game was seen and heard. They put microphones on players and coaches, capturing grunts and curses and primal screams, making the viewer feel like an insider in the trenches. They used ground-level, slow-motion cinematography, the camera shuddering with the impact of blocks, the mud and grass flying in elegant arcs. And they had the voice. John Facenda, whose sonorous, solemn baritone could make a Tuesday practice in Green Bay sound like the opening of the Book of Genesis. Facenda didn't narrate. He intoned. The quarterback is a target, a marked man in a crosshair, he would say, as a linebacker bore down on a helpless passer. The language was fatalistic, heroic. The violence wasn't unfortunate. It was inevitable, even beautiful. The soaring orchestral scores, the power and the glory, provided the emotional soundtrack, turning a gang tackle into a ballet, a sack into a moment of tragic triumph. NFL Films taught America how to feel about football. It taught us that the hit was the climax, the moment of truth. It aestheticized the collision, stripping it of its medical reality and draping it in the robes of art. We weren't watching men harm each other. We were watching a symphony of sacrifice. Then came the live broadcast revolution, crystallized by Monday Night Football in 1970. This wasn't just another game. It was a weekly television event, a primetime spectacle. The broadcast booth became a central character. Howard Cosell, with his acerbic, intellectualized diction, Frank Gifford, the handsome everyman, and Don Meredith, the folksy ex-quarterback, created a new dynamic. They weren't just describing the action. They were curating the narrative, and often that narrative centered on toughness. Cosell, in particular, would wax philosophical about the brutality of the sport, but his tone was one of awe, not condemnation. He helped frame the players as modern gladiators, and the Monday night audience as privileged witnesses to their ordeal. The technology kept pace. The instant replay, pioneered in the 1960s, and later the slow-motion replay, changed everything. A hit that lasted a fraction of a second in real time could now be isolated, rewound, and analyzed from 3 different angles. What was once a blur of action became a studied, technical display. The broadcasters would break down the form of the tackle, admiring the helmet placement, the drive of the legs, the wrapping up. The physical toll on the ball carrier, the whiplash, the brain slamming against the skull, was never part of the technical analysis. The replay aestheticized the violence, making it a thing to be appreciated for its efficiency and power, not its consequence. It turned a potentially penalizable, dangerous act into a teachable moment in applied physics. This aesthetic and narrative foundation paved the way for the most blatant celebration of the violence. The highlight reel culture. Shows like ESPN's SportsCenter, which launched in 1979, changed the sports conversation. Football was no longer consumed solely as a full-game narrative. It was consumed as a series of explosive, disconnected moments. The biggest hits were always featured, always replayed, always set to pounding rock music. The message was clear. This is what matters. This is what we want you to see. The apotheosis of this trend was ESPN's Jacked Up segment on Monday Night Football in the early 2000s. Hosted by defensive stalwarts like Tom Jackson, the segment was a weekly tribute to the biggest, most violent hits. It was pure spectacle, Jackson and his colleagues would whoop and holler as clips played of players being knocked unconscious, fumbling the ball, or lying dazed on the turf. The language was celebratory and dehumanizing. He got decleated. They took his lunch money. Welcome to the NFL, rookie. A hit that might have drawn a penalty flag or should have triggered a concussion check was instead packaged as entertainment, as a rite of passage. The segment actively celebrated the very outcomes that the league's medical staff was supposedly trying to prevent. It created a direct, perverse feedback loop. The more violently you hit, the more likely you were to be featured on national television, to have your name chanted by fans, to gain a reputation as a hard hitter. The incentive structure was naked. Inflict spectacular damage and be rewarded with fame. The commentary booth's language evolved to serve this new, highlight-driven reality. The analyst, often a former player himself steeped in the old code, became the chief validator of the hit. Phrases like, "he's a football player," were now deployed in real time. When a player staggered to his feet after a vicious hit, the announcer would say, "He's a little shaken up, but he's a warrior. He'll shake it off." This performed a crucial cultural function. It told the audience how to interpret what they were seeing. The player wobbling was not a medical emergency. He was a warrior displaying courage. The act of staying in the game after such a hit was framed as the story, not the hit itself. The analyst provided the moral of the story before it was even over. Furthermore, broadcasters began to openly question a player's toughness if he left the game after a big hit. "You have to wonder if he wants it enough," they might muse. Or, "That's a big loss for the team. He's their leader, and he needs to find a way to get back out there." This placed the onus not on the medical staff to protect the player, but on the player to defy medical logic for the sake of the team narrative being spun in the broadcast booth. The commentator became the voice of the old-school code, pressuring the player in real time in front of millions to conform to the myth. Television, in essence, completed the feedback loop of the toughness myth. It took the archetypes from the writers and the doctrine from the coaches and made them visceral, immediate, and spectacular. It showed us the hit in beautiful, punishing slow motion, told us it was glorious with a sonorous voice or a raucous celebration, and then challenged the players to live up to the superhuman standard it had just created. It turned the stadium experience into a national, shared ritual. And in doing so, it made the audience complicit. We weren't just passive observers. We were consumers of the violence. Our ratings validated the jacked up segments. Our enjoyment of the slow-motion collision was the product being sold to advertisers. Television didn't just report the culture of toughness. It became its most profitable engine, monetizing the very thing that was eroding the men on the field. Packaged the poison as the product. And we all bought it every Sunday and Monday night from the comfort of our homes. The television machine had given the myth a heartbeat and a paycheck. But to sustain this machine, to feed the narrative week after week, required a deeper, more intimate form of storytelling. It required the creation of legends, not just highlights. It required the magazine profile. The television screen showed us the images, but it was the voices that told us what they meant. Those voices, emanating from the broadcast booth with a tone of absolute certainty, became the sonic wallpaper of the sport for generations. They were not mere narrators. They were interpreters, historians, and most potently, validators. With a timbre of authority, a well-placed phrase, or a strategic silence, these broadcasters and analysts performed a crucial cultural alchemy. They translated the chaotic, often brutal reality of the game into a sanctioned narrative of heroism and sacrifice. Their words did not just describe the action. They framed its moral universe. And in that universe, the cardinal virtue was a very specific, very destructive brand of toughness. We must begin with the foundational voice, the one that established the epic template. John Facenda of NFL Films. Facenda's was not a voice of sportscasting. It was the voice of God, or at least of God's historian. His solemn, baritone pronouncements, laid over slow-motion footage, did not comment on the game. They consecrated it. When Facenda said, "The quarterback is a target," he wasn't stating a football fact. He was invoking a sense of fatalistic drama. He was telling us that the violence about to unfold was not an accident. but an ordained consequence of the quarterback's brave decision to enter the arena. His language was rich with metaphor and martial grandeur. Players weren't athletes. They were crusaders, gladiators, warriors in the steel-gray dusk. A hit wasn't a hit. It was the hammer of justice or the price of admission. Facenda's genius was in removing all contingency and medical reality from the equation. In his narration, pain was not a neurological event. It was a spiritual offering. Suffering was not to be treated. It was to be revered as proof of commitment. He gave the violence a mythology, a sense of higher purpose. He made it beautiful, and in making it beautiful, he made it acceptable, even aspirational. He was the first and most potent voice to teach America that football wasn't merely a game you watched. It was a saga you witnessed. Then came the voices of live broadcast, who had to apply this mythic framework to the unpredictable, real-time chaos of the game. In the 1970s and 80s, the archetypal pairing was Pat Summerall and John Madden. Summerall provided the sparse, laconic, almost priestly play-by-play. His voice was calm, deep, and unquestionably authoritative. He stated facts as immutable truths. When a player lay motionless after a hit, Summerall might say with grave calm, "He's down and he is hurt." The simplicity was powerful. It framed the moment not as a potential medical emergency, but as a solemn pause in the epic, a moment of sacrifice. He then handed the analysis to John Madden. Madden's persona was the boisterous, passionate ex-coach, but his analysis was deeply technical and always filtered through the lens of the old code. Madden's authority came from his Super Bowl ring and his perceived embodiment of football's earthy, blue-collar heart. When a player stayed in the game after a vicious hit, Madden would roar, "Now that's a football player." Boom! That exclamation, "Boom!" was more than a signature. It was a stamp of approval. It was the sound of the myth being validated by a high priest. Madden would often express admiration for players who sucked it up and played, framing their decision as the ultimate act of team loyalty. His technical breakdowns of blocks and tackles always emphasized toughness and effort as tangible, coachable skills, further cementing the idea that withstanding pain was a component of football IQ, not a biological limit. The analyst's role created a profound and often unspoken pressure, especially for former players in the booth. They were hired for their credibility, for their insider knowledge of the code. To criticize that code, to question the foundational premise of playing through injury, would be to undermine their own careers, their own legacies, and the very culture that had made them heroes. So they became its most eloquent enforcers. A former linebacker like ESPN's Tom Jackson, on the Jacked Up segment, wasn't just analyzing. He was cheerleading the violence, his enthusiasm pressuring the next generation to seek the same approval he was bestowing. A Hall of Fame quarterback like Troy Aikman in the Fox booth might question a tactical decision, but he would very rarely question the underlying ethos of sacrifice. When a quarterback took a late hit and stayed down, Aikman's commentary would often focus on the penalty flag or the protection breakdown, not on the wisdom of that quarterback returning to the game. To do otherwise would be to betray the fraternity. The analyst's chair became a seat of judgment, where the primary criterion for praise was often a visible, demonstrative tolerance for pain. They created a real-time feedback loop. A player makes a courageous catch over the middle, knowing he will be hit. The analyst praises his fearlessness and wanting it more. The player, hearing this later, internalizes the praise. The next time, he takes an even bigger hit to earn that validation again. The voice in the booth becomes the voice in his head, reinforcing the code every Sunday. This blurring of the line between analyst and cheerleader reached its peak in figures like John Madden and later John Gruden. Gruden's QB camp and his Monday Night Football commentary were powered by an almost manic enthusiasm for football guys. His language was a torrent of jargon and intensity, but at its core, it celebrated a specific, anachronistic ideal of toughness. He loved spit-in-your-face types, players with a mean streak. His analysis often glorified the physical confrontation over the strategic nuance. When praising a blocker, he would focus on the violence of the drive block, the finish, rather than the positioning that made it possible. He was, in essence, a televised version of the hard-nosed coach, his excited praise serving the same validating function as a coach's nod on the practice field. His authority came from his coaching pedigree, and he used it to sanctify the very behaviors that the league's health and safety policies were, on paper, trying to curb. The sound of authority, therefore, was not a monolith, but a chorus, from Facenda's somber God voice, to Summerall's grave pronouncements, to Madden's exuberant validation, to the conflicted enforcement of former players in the analyst chair. Together, they created an inescapable sonic environment that normalized the abnormal. They taught us that the sound of a clean, hard hit was the sound of good football, that a player staggering to his feet was the opening note of a hero's anthem, that silence from a fallen player was not a cue for concern, but a moment of respectful pause before the saga continued. These voices took the complex, morally ambiguous reality of a violent sport and simplified it into a resonant, compelling, and ultimately damaging story. They held the microphone, and in doing so, they controlled the narrative. But to build a legend that lasted all week, that seeped into the cultural consciousness beyond the 3-hour broadcast, required a different medium. It required the printed word to return, not as daily news, but as permanent profile. It required the myth to be etched not in sound, but in ink. The voice from the television faded with the final whistle, but the myth it amplified needed a more permanent home. It needed to be captured not in fleeting sound waves, but in something tangible, something that could be held, saved, and revisited. It needed the weight of the print. In the mid to late 20th century, as television turned football into a weekly spectacle, print magazines, most notably Sports Illustrated, became the archivists and theologians of the tough gospel. They provided the deep lore. Between their glossy covers, they didn't just report on players. They canonized them. Through iconic photography, sweeping narrative prose, and intimate profiles, magazines performed a critical cultural function. They translated the episodic violence of the game into a coherent, lifelong legend of character, where suffering was not a detour, but the central crucible in which greatness was forged. The power began with the cover. A Sports Illustrated the cover was more than news. It was an anointing. To be featured was to enter the national pantheon of athletes, and the imagery chosen for football players was profoundly symbolic. It was rarely a player smiling in triumph after a touchdown. More often, it was a study in grim determination, in battered majesty. It was Johnny Unitas, his face streaked with mud and blood, calling a play in the 1958 NFL Championship, an image that defined the field general as a gritty warrior. It was Dick Butkus, crouched in his linebacker stance, his eyes radiating a predatory fury, the personification of defensive menace. It was a mud-caked, exhausted Brett Favre. These covers sold an idea. The true football hero is not pristine. He is marked by battle. The dirt, the blood, the sweat, the grimace. These were not signs of disarray. They were the insignia of authenticity. The cover presented the player as a monument, frozen in a moment of struggle, and in doing so, it told the reader that the struggle itself was the point of admiration. You weren't buying a magazine about a sport. You were buying a portrait of a gladiator. But the true embedding of the myth happened in the feature stories that unfolded inside. Writers like Frank DeFord, Dan Jenkins, and Rick Telander moved beyond game statistics and into the realm of biography and moral exploration. Their lengthy profiles sought to answer the question, what makes this man capable of such violence and such endurance? The answer, almost invariably, was found in a narrative of pain overcome. The feature story framed a player's biography as an odyssey where physical suffering was the recurring monster to be slain, and each victory over it revealed a deeper layer of his heroic character. These stories often followed a recognizable arc. The humble origins, the early adversity, the rise to prominence marked by a key injury played through, and the subsequent ascension to leadership precisely because of that act of sacrifice. The language was rich with metaphor. A player didn't have a high pain threshold. He possessed an almost mystical tolerance for agony. He didn't ignore a doctor's advice. He defied medical science. His knee wasn't surgically repaired. It was rebuilt by the hands of a wizard, and his return was a resurrection. These profiles served as detailed case studies in the toughness doctrine. When Frank Deford wrote about playing through pain, he wasn't merely describing an action. He was conducting a moral inquiry, and his conclusion often sanctified the choice. The player who submitted to surgery and rehab was responsible. The player who refused surgery, taped the injury up, and played was courageous, transcendent. The story would linger on the gritty details. The endless hours of treatment, the numbing injections on the sidelines, the sleepless nights filled with pain. These were not presented as warnings or as evidence of a broken system. They were presented as the secret rituals of a priesthood. The reader was made to feel like an insider, privy to the sacred, painful rites that transformed a man into a legend. The effect was to make the abnormal seem noble. What might look like recklessness or a coercive culture from the outside was framed, from the intimate perspective of the profile, as sheer, awe-inspiring will. The archetypes crafted by the early sports writers were now given full, novelistic depth. The Iron Man was no longer just a nickname for Cal Ripken in baseball. In football, it was a philosophical ideal explored in stories about quarterbacks like Ron Jaworski or linebackers like Jack Lambert. Men portrayed as so relentlessly durable they seemed forged from something other than flesh. Their consecutive start streaks were chronicled not just as statistical curiosities, but as moral achievements, each game a new link in a chain of commitment that outweighed any physical complaint. The warrior archetype was explored through players like Steve Largent or Ray Nitschke, men whose ferocity was portrayed as an expression of a deep, almost spiritual love for the battle itself. Their injuries were not setbacks. They were scars earned in a beloved war. The magazine profile provided the backstory, the motivation, the emotional landscape that made the archetype believable and aspirational. This narrative machinery had a profound impact on the players themselves. To be the subject of a major sports illustrated profile was a career milestone. It meant you had graduated from athlete to icon, and players understood the terms of the canonization. They knew the stories that resonated were stories of overcoming, of suffering silently, of embodying the code. In interviews with these writers, they often performed the role expected of them. They downplayed injuries. They spoke in the language of sacrifice and team. They offered up anecdotes of playing hurt, knowing these would become the centerpiece of their legend. The magazine profile became a collaborative act of myth-making, where the player provided the raw material of his pain, and the writer sculpted it into a public monument. This dynamic encouraged players to endure even more, to gather more of the gritty, painful anecdotes that would one day define their legacy in ink. Their pain became a form of currency, traded for a lasting place in the story of the game. The magazine Mythos, therefore, was the bridge between the ephemeral spectacle of television and the permanent record of history. It took the weekly highlights and the sonorous commentary and deepened them into character. It provided the why. Why did he play? Because he was a warrior. Why did he endure? Because he was iron. It embedded the toughness narrative into the cultural psyche not as a fleeting observation, but as a fundamental truth about the nature of football and the men who played it. It created a library of legends where the central plot was always resilience in the face of physical ruin. But this was still a narrative driven by outsiders, writers, photographers, editors. The league itself watched this myth-making with keen interest, seeing its commercial potential. And soon it decided to cut out the middleman. It would build its own film studio, compose its own scores, and narrate its own epic. The magazines had written the scripture. Now, the league would produce the sacred texts itself. The magazines provided the written canon, a library of legends. But to feel the myth in your bones, to have it seep into your bloodstream, required a more visceral medium. It required movement, sound, and music. It required cinema. And in perhaps the most brilliant act of self-mythologization in the history of sports, the National Football League built its own Hollywood studio. NFL Films, born in the 1960s under the visionary, almost evangelical direction of Ed and Steve Sabol, did not document football, transfigured it. It took the raw, often ugly data points of a violent sport and, through the alchemy of slow-motion cinematography, orchestral scores, and godlike narration, produced a sacred and sensual text. This was not reporting. This was revelation. And in this revelation, the league itself became the chief curator, theologian, and poet of its own legendary violence. It built the most persuasive cathedral for the very same sacrifices it would later, in courtrooms and congressional hearings, claim to have misunderstood. The innovation was total, and it began with the gaze of the camera. Steve Sabol, the poetic force behind the operation, described it as seeing the unseeable. NFL Films cameras abandoned the sterile, high-angle perspective of the broadcast view. They invaded the field. They were placed on the sidelines, in the end zones, and even on cables swooping overhead. They used slow motion not just for replay, but as the primary mode of seeing. This technical choice was an artistic and philosophical revolution. A routine tackle, in real time a blur of force, became in slow motion a ballet of grotesque beauty. You could see the precise moment the helmet made contact, the ripple of the jersey, the spray of sweat and sod, the contortion of the face mask, the eyes going wide at the moment of impact. The violence was atomized, aestheticized, stripped of its consequence and repackaged as art. The sound design amplified this. They wired players and coaches, capturing the guttural sounds of effort and collision, the thwack of pads, the quarterback's desperate shout, the linebacker's primal roar. This wasn't background noise. It was the soundtrack of authenticity. It made you feel like you were inside the helmet, privy to the secret, brutal symphony of the game. The combined effect of the slow-motion gaze and the amplified sound was hypnotic. It encouraged a state of awe, not analysis. You weren't thinking about cervical vertebrae or axonal shearing. You were marveling at the physics and the fearlessness. The medium meticulously removed the human context and elevated the collision to the level of pure, abstract spectacle. Then came the score. If the images and sounds provided the raw sensory data, the music composed by Sam Spence and others provided the emotional interpretation. This was not the pep band brass of a college fight song. This was sweeping, cinematic, fully orchestral music. It borrowed from the traditions of Hollywood epics and wartime propaganda films. There were heroic fanfares for the charging offense, ominous, driving rhythms for the defensive pursuit, and tragic, elegiac strings for the fallen warrior slow to rise. The music told you precisely how to feel about what you were seeing. A quarterback being sacked by a blitzing linebacker wasn't a medical risk or a tactical failure. Set to a thunderous, dramatic crescendo, it was a moment of tragic heroism, the quarterback a noble sacrifice to the defensive gods. The music attached a grand, spiritual significance to the physical event. It implied that something of monumental importance was occurring, something that transcended yards and points. It framed the game as a Wagnerian opera, where each hit was a note in a grand, fatalistic composition. The suffering had a score, and the score was beautiful. And finally, the voice of John Facenda. He was not a sportscaster. He was the voice of God. His baritone was solemn, resonant, and impossibly authoritative. He did not merely describe, he pronounced. His scripts, often penned by Steve Sabol, were pure poetry steeped in classical and martial metaphor. The frozen tundra of Lambeau Field. The quarterback is a target, a marked man in a crosshair. They call it professional football, but it's more like warfare. Facenda's narration performed the final, crucial act of translation. He took the aestheticized violence and gave it a mythic framework. In his telling, players were not employees of a sports league. They were crusaders, gladiators, paladins in plastic armor. Their journey was not a season schedule. It was an odyssey. Their pain was not an injury. It was a trial. His language consistently elevated the physical contest to the plane of existential struggle. This served a profound purpose. It morally justified the violence. If this is war, then wounds are expected, and playing with them is the ultimate virtue. If this is a crusade, then pain is a form of penance on the path to glory. Facenda's voice was the sound of the myth becoming scripture, and NFL Films was the church that played it on a loop. This self-generated canon had a transformative effect on the public perception of the sport. For generations of fans, NFL Films was the soul of football. The weekly broadcasts were the reality, but the film's highlight reels were the truth. A more beautiful, more heroic, more meaningful truth. It taught several generations how to romanticize the game. It created a powerful nostalgia not just for players or teams, but for a feeling, the feeling of epic struggle set to stirring music. This curated nostalgia became a potent shield for the league. When criticisms of the sport's violence arose, they were not just arguing against a game, they were arguing against an art form, against a deeply held emotional memory. How could something so beautiful be so bad? The league's own art had inoculated it against accusations of barbarism. Most crucially, NFL films gave the league absolute control over its own narrative. Unlike newspapers or independent documentaries, this was propaganda in its purest, most elegant form, propaganda that the audience willingly consumed as entertainment. The league decided which hits were glorious, which players were heroic, which moments of suffering were poignant. It crafted the definitive version of its own history, one where the central theme was courage and sacrifice, not profit and liability. This control extended to the players themselves. To be featured in an NFL films production, to hear your hit glorified by Facenda's voice and Spence's score, was the highest form of flattery from the institution itself. It was the league saying, "This is what we value. This is what we immortalize." The message was clear. To be remembered, to be part of the eternal story, you must provide the raw material of spectacular, sacrificial violence. The films created the ultimate incentive structure for on-field behavior, authored by the employer itself. In the end, the documentary canon of NFL films represents the most sophisticated and successful effort to brand violence in American cultural history. It took the central, dangerous product of the league, the violent collision, and through artistic genius, transformed it from a liability into its most marketable asset. It aestheticized the very thing that would later form the basis of thousands of lawsuits and a public health crisis. It made the problem look like the solution. It made the poison taste like nectar. The league didn't just sell tickets and television rights. It sold a myth, and it built the most elegant factory for that myth ever conceived. But this myth, for all its artistic power, did not exist in an ethereal realm. It had a concrete financial value. The glorious violence curated on film translated directly into revenue. The spectacle had to be monetized, and the players who provided its most vivid moments were not just artists in a symphony. They were laborers in a brutal, profit-driven enterprise. The poetry of the films had a very direct prose counterpart, the balance sheet. The poetry of NFL films, the sonorous narration, the heroic magazine profiles, they all created a powerful myth. But a myth in the modern world is not merely a story. It is a commodity. The glorification of football toughness was not an accidental byproduct of enthusiasm. It was the essential fuel for a multi-billion-dollar economic engine. The league did not just admire toughness. It monetized it. Every spectacular hit immortalized in slow motion, every story of a player sucking it up and taking the field, every grimace of pain framed as a badge of honor, served a concrete financial purpose. It sold tickets, drove television ratings, moved merchandise, and justified enormous advertising contracts. And within this engine, the players learned a brutal calculus. Their willingness to treat their bodies as disposable assets directly translated to marketability, contract incentives, and the most fragile commodity of all, job security. The culture of sacrifice was not just a mindset, it was a market force. For the star player, toughness was a central pillar of his brand, and that brand had direct monetary value. Consider the quarterback who takes a vicious hit, gets up slowly, and leads a game-winning drive. That narrative is worth millions, sells jerseys. It makes him the face of national advertising campaigns for trucks, insurance, and sports drinks. Companies don't want to associate with fragility. They want to associate with indomitable will. A player known for his grit and leadership, code words often rooted in his visible tolerance for pain, becomes a more appealing pitchman than a player of equal skill who is perceived as soft or injury-prone. This perception is shaped entirely by the media narrative we've traced. The player who hides a concussion and throws a touchdown is a warrior. The player who reports that concussion and sits out is, in the whispered language of scouts and talk radio, a question mark. That question mark translates to smaller endorsement deals and less leverage in contract negotiations. A reputation for toughness became an intangible but crucial line item on a star's financial ledger, encouraging them to play hurt to protect not just their team's chances, but their own market value. This financialization of toughness was made explicit in the structure of player contracts. While the modern collective bargaining agreement has limits, for decades contracts were laden with performance incentives that indirectly rewarded playing through injury. The most common were per-game active roster bonuses. A player would receive a significant sum, sometimes tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, for each game he was on the active 46-man roster on Sunday. This created a direct, immediate financial incentive to be available regardless of health. Telling a coach or trainer you couldn't play didn't just let the team down. It literally cost you money. Even more impactful were incentives for statistical milestones. Tackles, sacks, rushing yards, receptions. A fringe starter needing 50 tackles to trigger a $500,000 bonus isn't thinking about the long-term health of his shoulder when he throws it into a fullback's chest in Week 17. He's thinking about his family's financial security. The contract, a document drafted by team lawyers, effectively baked the play-through pain ethos into its financial clauses. It turned medical decisions into cost-benefit analyses, where the potential future cost of a worsened injury was weighed against the guaranteed, immediate benefit of a bonus check. The system was designed to make the economically rational choice also the physically dangerous one. For the vast majority of players who are not stars, the economic pressure was even more acute and existential. This is the realm of the fringe roster player, the late-round draft pick, the undrafted free agent, the veteran clinging to a career. For these men, there is no brand. For the vast majority of players who are not stars, the economic pressure was even more acute and existential. This is the realm of the fringe roster player, the late-round draft pick, the undrafted free agent, the veteran clinging to a career. For these men, there is no brand. There are no lucrative endorsement deals. There is only a job that pays a handsome salary but can vanish in an instant. Their path to making the team and then staying on it is often through violence currency. They must demonstrate a tangible, visceral value that transcends pure athleticism or schematic fit. They must show they are willing to do the dirty, painful work that others might shirk. This means being a demon on special teams, throwing your body into wedge blocks on kick returns with utter disregard for your own safety. It means delivering highlight reel hits in preseason games when the starters are in baseball caps on the sideline. It means playing through injuries that an established star would use as a reason to rest, because your absence is not a news story. It is an opportunity for the next hungry body to take your place. The practice squad, the bottom rung of the NFL ladder, is a pure distillation of this economics. These are players paid a weekly salary to serve as practice fodder for the starters. Their job is to mimic the upcoming opponent, to absorb hits from the first-team defense, and to do so while knowing they are utterly disposable. To complain of pain, to seek extra treatment, to hesitate in a drill, is to mark yourself as a poor investment. Coaches and general managers speak openly about valuing availability. It is the paramount virtue for a backup or role player. Can we count on him? Is not a question about skill. It is a question about his willingness to be present and in pain. A player who acquires a label as injury-prone or soft sees his career evaporate, regardless of his talent. This creates a culture of silence and deception. Players take Toradol shots to mask high ankle sprains. They borrow painkillers from teammates to get through practice. They learn to describe their injuries in minimizing language. It's just a stinger, I'm good. It's tight, but I can go. Their economic survival depends on performing wellness and willingness, on converting their physical durability into the currency of trust from the coaching staff. The league and its teams, of course, benefited enormously from this system. It provided a constant stream of the toughness narrative that fed the media machine and delighted fans. It ensured that on any given Sunday, the product on the field would be played at maximum intensity by men pushing far beyond reasonable physical limits, because their livelihoods depended on it. It externalized the long-term costs of this behavior. The team paid for the immediate surgery, but the lifetime of chronic pain, arthritis, and cognitive issues was borne by the player and his family, or by public disability systems. The economic engine was built on a form of deferred liability, where the most significant costs were pushed years into the future, off the league's balance sheets and onto the damaged bodies of the men who powered it. This economic reality exposes the deep hypocrisy at the heart of the operation. The same institution that produced films glorifying violent collisions would later, in legal depositions, claim it never understood the dangers of those collisions. The same coaches who praised a player's warrior mentality would cut him without a second thought when his warrior's body finally broke down. The economic engine demanded the myth of the gladiator, but it offered the safety net of a temporary contractor. The message was clear. We will celebrate your sacrifice in our art, reward it in your short-term contracts, and then discard you when the bill for that sacrifice comes due. The poetry of toughness always had a price, but that price was never included in the salary cap. It was a debt that would be collected later, in quiet rooms far from the roaring crowds. And within the team fortress, this economic pressure created a society unto itself, with its own rules, its own enforcement mechanisms, and its own cruel punishments for those who broke the code. The financial stakes simply raised the voltage on a system that was already wired for denial. The economic engine created the pressure, the external force. But the real mechanism of enforcement, the place where the myth became a lived, breathing, and brutally policed reality, was inside the locker room. This was the echo chamber, the sacred, sweaty, tape-strewn sanctuary where the media narratives were internalized, where the coach's gospel was translated into pure law, and where the concept of toughness ceased to be an ideal and became a daily referendum on a man's worth. Here, away from the cameras and the microphones, the culture of football forged its own immune system, a code of silence, a currency of pain, and a deep, abiding shame attached to the admission of weakness. In this sealed environment, a player didn't just let down a faceless fan base by getting injured. He betrayed his brothers. He was seen as selling out the team. To step into an NFL locker room is to enter a tribe with its own rigid hierarchy, its own rituals, and its own definition of honor. At the top are the veterans, the stars, the team captains, the living embodiments of the code. They are the ones who have been through it. Their bodies are archives of scars and surgeries. Their minds repositories of pain they have ignored. Their authority is not granted by the coaching staff. It is earned through years of visible sacrifice. And they are the chief enforcers of the locker room's prime directive: availability. A young player watches how these men operate. He sees the star receiver getting his ankle taped into a state of rigid immobilization, then going out to run precise routes. He hears the middle linebacker talk about playing with a broken hand, the cast hidden beneath his padding. He observes the silent rituals of pre-game Toradol injections, a line of men quietly turning their backsides to the team doctor. This is the curriculum. The lesson is not taught in a meeting. It is absorbed through the atmosphere. To be accepted into this tribe, you must prove you speak the language of denial. This is where the external media myths are internalized and weaponized. The archetypes of the warrior and the gladiator are not abstractions here. They are job descriptions. When a player is described by his teammates as a dog or a beast, it is the highest compliment. It means he plays with a ferocity that disregards his own safety. The language of the broadcast booth and the magazine profile becomes the locker room's vernacular, but stripped of its poetry and sharpened into a tool of peer pressure. Shake it off. Rub some dirt on it. Be a football player. These phrases are delivered not by faceless announcers, but by the man whose locker is next to yours, the man you break bread with, the man you trust to have your back on the field. Their disapproval carries an emotional weight no coach's scorn can match. To be seen as soft by your peers is a social death within the tribe. It means isolation. It means your dedication is questioned in hushed tones. It means you become the subject of soft jokes that are not really jokes, but subtle, continuous reinforcements of the boundary between us and him. The shame attached to injury is the code's most powerful enforcement tool. This is not the shame of being hurt. It is the shame of allowing that hurt to matter. An injury is often treated not as a random, unfortunate event, but as a personal failing, a lack of preparation, or a deficit of mental fortitude. A player who goes down with a non-contact knee injury might face sidelong glances that silently ask, Did you train hard enough? Were you strong enough? A player with a concussion who reports his symptoms might be praised publicly, but privately, some teammates might question his commitment, wondering if he could have fought through it. The most damning phrase one player can use about another is, "He doesn't want it." It doesn't refer to victory. It refers to the willingness to endure the physical cost of pursuing victory. To be labeled as someone who doesn't want it is to have your very heart, your core desire, invalidated. This shame is so potent because it attacks a player's identity. He has defined himself as a football player, as a tough guy since he was a boy. To have that identity questioned from within his own fraternity is psychologically devastating. It is often easier to play in pain than to face that questioning. This creates the code of silence. It is an unwritten, unspoken, but universally understood pact. You do not talk about your pain in a way that suggests you cannot handle it. You do not detail your injuries to the media in a manner that could be construed as making excuses. You certainly do not publicly question the culture or the system that demands your sacrifice. The code is enforced through stories and legends that circulate within the room. The story of the player who had his knee drained at halftime and finished the game. The legend of the guy who played with a punctured lung. These stories are not told as cautionary tales. They are told as parables of saintly dedication, the scriptures of the tribe. They set the standard, and they silence the dissenter. A player considering reporting concussion symptoms remembers these parables and questions his own worthiness. He stays silent. The ultimate transgression, the unforgivable sin, is selling out the team. This concept is the nuclear option of locker room peer pressure. It frames a player's decision to protect his own long-term health not as a personal medical choice, but as an act of treachery against the collective. If you sit out, you are forcing someone else to take your reps, to play exhausted, to carry your load. You are, in this twisted calculus, putting your own well-being above the well-being of 52 other men and an entire organization. The economic pressures of Batch 7 amplify this feeling. Your backup is often a friend, a guy fighting for his own career and financial future. To say you can't go is to potentially hand him your job permanently. The guilt is layered and profound. It's not just about the game. It's about a brother's livelihood. This environment makes the decision to seek medical attention an act of profound social courage, one that many young men, deeply invested in their tribal belonging, simply cannot muster. The result is a self-policing system of astonishing efficiency. Coaches don't need to explicitly order players to hide concussions. The culture they helped create, amplified by the media and cemented by the veterans in the room, does that work for them. The team doctor walking through the locker room is not always seen as a healer. He can be viewed as an adversary, a gatekeeper who must be convinced of your fitness to join your brothers in battle. Players become adept at passing concussion protocol tests they've memorized, at hiding dizziness, at attributing headaches to dehydration. The locker room echo chamber amplifies the external myth until it becomes an internal truth. Pain is weakness leaving the body. Reporting injury is disloyalty, and the only valid state of being is ready to go. This closed ecosystem perfected the art of sacrifice, but it could not function without the tacit and often active cooperation of the very profession sworn to protect those men from themselves. The tribe had its rules. It was time to examine the shamans who were supposed to tend to the wounded warriors, but who often found their oath to do no harm in conflict with their paycheck from the tribe itself. The locker room code provided the social pressure, the economic engine provided the financial incentive, but for the system to function at its most destructive efficiency, it required a final, critical authority, a medical seal of approval. This authority was vested in the team doctors and athletic trainers, the men with the black bags and the syringes, standing on the boundary between the player's health and the organization's need. In earlier eras, and with lingering echoes today, these medical professionals operated in a profound and often unresolvable conflict. Their sworn duty was to the patient, the athlete before them. Their employed duty, their paycheck, and their professional standing within the football world depended on their service to the organization. And the organization's primary need, especially on game day, was not optimal long-term health. It was short-term availability. This conflict created a culture of medical complicity, where the tools of healing, the injection, the painkiller, the expert tape job, were repurposed as tools of enablement, sending mythologized men back into the fray with their warning systems deliberately disabled. The cornerstone of this complicity was the shift from a diagnostic question to a utilitarian one. The standard was not, is this injury safe to play with? Or, what is the long-term risk of exacerbating this condition? The standard, often unspoken but universally understood, was, can you play? This simple three-word phrase carried immense ethical weight. It redirected the medical inquiry away from pathology and toward performance. A doctor asking, can you play? Is not functioning solely as a physician. He is acting as a personnel evaluator for the coach. The player, steeped in the locker room code and aware of the economic stakes, here's not a medical query but a test of his worth. His answer, and the doctor's subsequent decision, becomes a referendum on his toughness and his value to the tribe. This framework turned the training room into a place of negotiation, not just treatment. The most potent symbol of this complicity was, and remains, the pre-game injection. The corticosteroid shot to numb a swollen joint. The Toradol injection, a powerful non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, administered not to treat a specific injury, but as a prophylactic blanket against the pain of the coming combat. These injections were rituals. Players would line up, often silently, to receive their dose. The effect was pharmacological hypocrisy. It allowed the player to fulfill his social and economic duty to play, while allowing the medical staff to fulfill their organizational duty to provide a healthy player. But the player was not healthy. He was anesthetized. The injection silenced the body's pain signals, its essential alarm system. A player on Toradol could not feel the difference between a minor strain and a major tear. He could not gauge the damage being done. The medical staff, by administering it, became active participants in a willful ignorance. They were not healing an injury. They were masking its symptoms so the injury could be worsened. This was medicine not as a practice of care, but as a practice of facilitation. The distribution of oral painkillers followed a similar pattern. Former players from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s describe a casual, rampant distribution of pills like Vicodin and Percocet. They were handed out in film sessions, dispensed in little white cups in the locker room, given in bulk for road trips. The intent was pragmatic. Manage pain, keep players on the field. The effect, however, was the creation of dependencies and the erosion of informed consent. Players were rarely given detailed warnings about addiction potential or side effects. The message was implicit. Take this, it will help you do your job. The team doctor or trainer, the figure in a position of ultimate medical trust, was thus the gateway to a chemical coping mechanism that often lasted long after the player's career was over. This was not malicious intent in most cases. It was a systemic failure born of the "can you play?" imperative. The medical staff's mindset became one of crisis management, getting the player through the next game, the next week, rather than long-term health stewardship. The athletic trainer's tape job became another tool of complicity. The art of taping an ankle or a knee into temporary stability is a marvel of sports medicine. But when used not to protect a mildly vulnerable joint but to immobilize a severely damaged one, it crosses an ethical line. The trainer, wrapping layer upon layer of adhesive tape, knows he is constructing a biological lie. He is creating the illusion of functional stability where there is structural deficiency. He is helping the player deceive his own nervous system and the opposing team. When the player takes the field, hobbling but held together by tape and will, the trainer's work is seen as dedication. In reality, it is a form of collusion. It allows everyone, the player, the coach, the fans, to believe the myth of toughness is being upheld, while the medical professional on the sidelines understands he has merely engineered a short-term, high-risk compromise. This conflict of interest was, and is, structured into the very employment of team medical staff. The team doctor is typically a highly respected orthopedic surgeon or primary care physician with a private practice. His affiliation with the team lends prestige to that practice. The athletic trainers are direct employees of the club. Their career advancement, their standing within the organization, even their job security, can be subtly or not so subtly tied to their perceived usefulness in keeping key players on the field. A team doctor known for being conservative or quick to sideline might find his influence waning. A trainer who aggressively pushes for a star to sit might be bypassed, his advice going unheard. The pressure is rarely a direct order. It is atmospheric. It is the coach's impatient glare during an examination on the sideline. It is the general manager asking for daily availability updates. It is the player himself begging to go back in, putting the medical professional in the impossible position of having to be the barrier between a willing warrior and his defined purpose. The tragic consequence of this complicity was the systematic invalidation of player suffering. When a player's pain is routinely masked, when his injuries are minimized by the very authorities he trusts, he learns to distrust his own body's signals. He internalizes the idea that pain is not real information, but merely an obstacle to be chemically or mechanically overcome. This broke the fundamental patient-doctor covenant. The player's body was no longer a subject of care. It was a piece of equipment to be maintained for Sunday's use. The medical staff, however well-intentioned on an individual level, became the mechanics for that equipment, focused on immediate functionality rather than long-term durability. They became essential components in the machine that produced the spectacle, applying their expertise not to halt the damage, but to allow the machine to keep running just a little longer game after game, season after season. But one form of damage could not be taped up, numbed, or silenced with pills. It was happening in the silent, dark vault of the skull, and the medical complicity surrounding it would lead to the sport's greatest crisis. The culture of "can you play?" was about to collide with a question it could no longer ignore. What have we done to their minds? The conflict between the "can you play?" culture and medical reality reached its terrifying, inevitable climax not in a torn ligament or a broken bone, but in the silent, intricate universe of the human brain. The case of concussion is the Rosetta Stone for deciphering the entire mythology of football toughness. It is where the league's narrative machinery, the complicity of its medical system, the pressure of the locker room, and the glorification of violence all converged to fight a decades-long, rearguard action against a scientific truth. This was not just a medical controversy. It was a narrative war. And for generations, the league's story, that concussions were minor, ephemeral injuries, battled against the emerging story of chronic catastrophic brain disease. The former was a story of resilience. The latter was a story of ruin. In the beginning, the league's narrative was simple and perfectly aligned with the existing toughness myth. Concussions were dings or getting your bell rung. The language itself, inherited from the sportswriter's lexicon, ensured they were seen as temporary, almost comic interruptions. The treatment protocol, visible every Sunday, reinforced this. A player would lie motionless on the turf. The crowd hushed. Trainers would rush out, hold up fingers. If the player could groggily count them, he would often be helped to the sideline, take a few whiffs of smelling salts, a theatrical, archaic remedy, and, amidst the cheers of the crowd recognizing his warrior spirit, re-enter the game. This public ritual was a powerful piece of storytelling. It showed the problem, the knockdown, the solution, the smelling salts, the toughness, and the redemption, the return. It visually reinforced the core myth. The brave man shakes off the stun and rejoins the battle. What it hid was the internal cataclysm. The brain, a 3-pound organ of soft tissue, slamming against the hard bone of the skull, unleashing a toxic chemical cascade, shearing microscopic neural connections. The public story was one of recovery. The biological reality was one of trauma. The league's institutional response to early warning signs was not to investigate, but to cure it. In 1994, concerned by a trickle of studies and player retirements due to head injuries, the NFL formed the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury (MTBI) Committee. It was led by Dr. Elliot Pellman, a rheumatologist with no background in neurology or brain trauma. For over a decade, this committee became the league's primary vehicle for controlling the narrative. It published a series of papers in a journal it helped fund, asserting that concussions in NFL players were minor and had no long-term consequences. Their most infamous conclusion, published in 2005, was that NFL players have evolved to a state where their brains are less susceptible to injury. This was not science. It was science fiction, a grotesque parody of the gladiator myth suggesting players had biologically adapted to violence. The committee's work was a masterclass in manufactured doubt, using the veneer of academic research to assure players, fans, and the media that the game was safe, that the bell-rung narrative was medically sound. It was the league applying a tape job and a pain-killing injection to its own growing liability. While the league committee produced its reassuring findings, a counter-narrative was being written in autopsy suites and pathology labs, beginning with the story of Mike Webster. Iron Mike's tragic descent into cognitive chaos and homelessness after his career ended was a mystery that haunted the football world. When he died in 2002, his family donated his brain to Dr. Bennett Omalu, a neuropathologist in Pittsburgh. Omalu, using sophisticated staining techniques, found what he had never seen in a young brain: widespread tau protein tangles, the hallmark of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, a disease previously associated with punch-drunk boxers. When Omalu published his findings in the journal Neurosurgery in 2005, the league's MTBI committee did not engage with the science. It launched a campaign to discredit him and retract the paper. They called him a doctor from Nigeria, implying he was an outsider, a fraud. They mobilized their own experts to attack his methodology. This was the narrative war turning vicious. The league was no longer just promoting its own story. It was actively seeking to destroy a competing one. The message to other scientists was clear: challenge our narrative at your professional peril. The dam began to crack not with a single scientific paper, but with the relentless work of investigative journalism. While sports media was largely still celebrating the big hit, pioneers outside the beat began connecting the dots. In 2006, New York Times reporters Alan Schwartz and Judy Battista started publishing stories that wove together the emerging pathology. The suicides of former players like Terry Long and Andre Waters, both found to have CTE, with the league's history of denial. Schwartz's reporting was methodical, patient, and devastating. He gave voice to the widows who described their husbands' transformations into paranoid, rageful, depressed strangers. He interviewed the scientists whom the league had marginalized. He exposed the flawed composition and conclusions of the MTBI committee. This journalism performed the essential function of translation. It took complex neuropathology and heartbreaking human stories and fused them into an undeniable public narrative. It reframed the tough players who had shaken off concussions not as heroes, but as unwitting victims of a system that had lied to them about the risks. The tipping point arrived with the story of Junior So. His suicide in 2012 was a national tragedy. Here was not a marginal player, but one of the most beloved, charismatic, and successful figures of his era. His family's decision to donate his brain, and the subsequent confirmation of advanced CTE, shattered the league's remaining plausible deniability. This was not a punch-drunk boxer or a lineman who played in a more violent era. This was Junior So, a modern superstar. His death forced the sports media, which had adored him, to confront the uncomfortable science it had long ignored or downplayed. The narrative war was effectively over. The league's story of benign dings collapsed under the weight of pathological evidence and public outrage. In the aftermath, the league settled a massive class action lawsuit with thousands of former players for over $1 billion, a stark financial admission of its prior failings, albeit without a formal admission of guilt. It disbanded the Pellman Committee and embraced, at least rhetorically, a new era of concussion protocol and safety research. But the cultural reckoning was more profound. The concussion crisis did not just change rules. It changed the story. It forced a rewrite of the entire toughness myth. The act of shaking it off was now seen not as valor, but as recklessness. The big hit, once the centerpiece of the highlight reel, was now viewed with a wince and a question about its cost. The language shifted from getting your bell rung to traumatic brain injury. The narrative of resilience had been permanently complicated by the narrative of ruin. Yet, even as this new, more painful story took hold, it faced its own powerful, intimate resistance. For the myth of toughness was not just a story told by the league and the media. It was a story passed from father to son, a generational inheritance that no scientific journal could easily rewrite. The myth of toughness was never confined to the locker room or the stadium. Its most potent, most enduring transmission occurred in a far more intimate arena, the family. It traveled in the genes, yes, but more powerfully, it traveled in the stories, the advice, and the unspoken expectations passed from father to son. This is the intergenerational dialectic of football. For decades, the father, often a former player himself, steeped in the old code, was the primary catechist of the Toughness Gospel. He taught his boy the right way to play. He instilled the ethos that defined his own identity. But as science began to rewrite the rules of safety, a heartbreaking conflict emerged. The old-school mentality, a father's hard-won wisdom, now collided with new-school science at the very dinner table where the lessons had first been served. The most personal of bonds became ground zero for the sport's existential crisis. Consider the archetype, the football father. He may have played in high school, college, or even the pros. His identity is inextricably linked to the lessons of the game. Discipline, sacrifice, resilience. When he teaches his son to throw a spiral, he is teaching more than mechanics. He is teaching a worldview. He says things like, "Get up, don't let them see you hurt," or "You have to be the toughest guy on the field," or the classic, "It's okay to be scared, but it's not okay to play scared." These are not just coaching tips. They are moral instructions. They frame pain as a test of character, and the refusal to acknowledge it as the ultimate proof of manhood. The father, sharing stories of his own playing days, inevitably highlights the times he played hurt. The broken finger taped to the next one. The sprained ankle he ran off. The concussion he shook off. These stories are told not as cautionary tales, but as foundational myths of the family. They are the father's Iliad, and the son is his eager audience, learning what it means to be a man in his father's image. The backyard catch becomes a seminary. The peewee game becomes a first communion. This dynamic is magnified exponentially when the father is a famous former player turned coach. The son carries not just a name, but a legacy. He isn't just playing for himself or his team. He is playing to validate an entire history. The pressure is a silent, constant companion. Every hit he takes, every hit he gives, is measured against an invisible standard set by his father's legend. The coaching from the sideline or the living room is filtered through a lifetime of believing in the old code. Former NFL quarterback Steve Young once spoke about the conflict of being a father in the modern era. He said he found himself instinctively wanting to tell his son to get up and shake it off after a big hit. But then he'd stop, remembering the CT research, the broken men he knew, and a new, more fearful internal voice would take over. He described it as a civil war in his mind. This is the dialectic in its rawest form, the ingrained impulse of the football father at war with the protective instinct of the modern parent who has seen the autopsy reports. For many sons of lesser-known players, the conflict is less public but more visceral. I think of a story, one of thousands. A father, a former college linebacker, now in his 50s, walks with a permanent limp and his hands tremble slightly. He loves football with a passion that borders on religion. He coaches his son's high school team. His son, a talented safety, takes a helmet-to-helmet hit in a game and is visibly dazed. The old reflex in the father, the coach, is to wave him to the sideline, give him a minute and send him back in. That's what was done to him. That's how he learned to be tough. But now there's a state-mandated concussion protocol. An independent athletic trainer, not employed by the school, pulls the son from the game. The father watches from the sideline, a storm of emotions on his face. There is concern for his boy, yes, but there is also, he confesses later in private, a flicker of frustration. A voice in him, the voice of his own father and his own coaches, whispers that his son is missing a crucial test, that he's being coddled, that the game is getting soft. He feels guilty for that thought immediately, but it is there, etched into his psyche by a lifetime of the code. That night, at home, the son asks, "Did I let you down?" The father's heart breaks. The very culture he helped instill has made his son feel like a failure for following a doctor's orders. The new school science, with its images of tau protein tangles and its stories of suicides, creates a terrifying cognitive dissonance in these families. The father's lived experience, the fact that he played through concussions and, in his mind, turned out fine, is directly challenged by statistical probabilities and pathological evidence. He is forced to confront a horrifying possibility. that the very lessons he most wants to impart, the lessons that made him who he is, might be dangerous. That his own lingering aches and cognitive fogs are not just badges of honor, but early warnings he ignored. To accept the new science is, in some profound way, to invalidate his own life's narrative, to question the value of his own sacrifices. It is to admit that the game he loves, and which defined him, might have broken him in ways he's not ready to see. So, the resistance is deep, emotional, and often subconscious. He may dismiss the CTE data as overblown or only for the weak. He may cling to the old language of dings and bell ringing. It is a defense mechanism to protect the meaning of his own past. For the son coming of age in this era, the landscape is confusing and fraught. He is pulled in two directions. From coaches, often older men echoing his father's generation, he hears the familiar mantras of toughness. From school assemblies, news reports, and maybe even a cautious mother, he hears about brain trauma, about the importance of reporting symptoms. He wants to please his father, to earn his respect by embodying the old ideal. But he also doesn't want to end up like the tragic figures he reads about. He lives in a dual reality. On the field, he is expected to be a warrior. Off it, he is told to be a patient. The code of the locker room tells him to hide weakness. The new protocols tell him to expose it. He is a teenager being asked to solve an ethical and physical puzzle that the entire sport has failed to solve for a century. This father-son dialectic is the crucible where the future of football's culture will be forged. Every time a father bites his tongue instead of telling his dazed son to shake it off, the old myth weakens. Every time a son confidently tells a coach he has a headache and needs to be checked, a new code is written. It is a slow, painful generational rewrite. The stories are changing. The parable is no longer just about the father who played on a broken ankle. It is increasingly about the father who, seeing his son wobble, ran onto the field not to berate him, but to hug him and take him to a doctor. The heroism is being redefined, not as the capacity to endure damage, but as the courage to acknowledge it. This shift is not happening in league offices or broadcast booths first. It is happening in minivans driving home from practice, in quiet conversations after games, in the silent, worried looks of parents in the stands who now know too much. The myth is meeting its most formidable opponent, a parent's love, armed with facts. But as this intimate revolution unfolds, a parallel one was brewing in the public sphere. Players, tired of having their stories told by others, began to seize the narrative themselves. They picked up pens and opened laptops, deciding to write their own truths. The narrative war over concussion produced a clear victor in science and a clear villain in the league's denialism. But on the battlefield of daily sports coverage, the change was not a switch being flipped. It was a slow, grinding, and deeply reluctant tectonic shift. The media's vocabulary, so carefully constructed over a century to glorify football's violence, did not simply evaporate. It was forced to evolve, often awkwardly, under the weight of undeniable evidence and public pressure. The 21st century, particularly the 2010s, became an era of linguistic reckoning. Old tropes, embedded in the muscle memory of broadcasters and writers, now clashed with a new, uncomfortable awareness in real time. The story was no longer just about the hit. It was about the aftermath. And the language had to catch up. The vanguard of this change was not found in the broadcast booth or on the highlight shows, but in the investigative units of major newspapers and later in long-form digital journalism. The pivotal figure was Alan Schwartz of the New York Times. Beginning in 2007, Schwartz did not write sports stories. He wrote public health stories that used football as his subject. His reporting was methodical, forensic, and devoid of the familiar heroic framing. His sentences were clean, factual, and devastating. He didn't call it getting your bell rung. He called it a concussion. He didn't describe a player as shaken up. He wrote that he displayed symptoms consistent with a traumatic brain injury. His sources were not coaches praising toughness, but neuropathologists like Bennett Omalu and Ann McKee, and the grieving families of players like Mike Webster and Justin Strzelczyk. Schwartz's work, and that of others at outlets like the Washington Post and ESPN's Outside the Lines, created a new journalistic playbook for covering football's dangers. They bypassed the league's PR apparatus and the standard locker room quotes, going straight to the medical literature and the human cost. This reporting forced a new lexicon into the sports section. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, tau proteins, subconcussive hits, neurocognitive decline. These were clinical, cold terms, and their very presence in sports pages was a revolution. They represented the intrusion of a harsh, biological truth into a space long reserved for myth. Meanwhile, in the broadcast booth and on studio panels, the transition was far more jarring and inconsistent. This was the awkward age. You could see and hear the cognitive dissonance play out live on air. An analyst, often a former player, would instinctively praise a defensive back for a great, clean, hard hit that left a receiver motionless. The replay would show the brutal collision. The analyst's voice would trail off. The play-by-play man, perhaps reading a producer's note in his ear, would then add, "And of course, you have to hope he's okay." That's the kind of hit the league is trying to get out of the game. The segment would end with an uncomfortable pause. The old reflex to celebrate the violence was immediately followed by the new obligation to acknowledge its danger. Created a bizarre moral whiplash for the viewer. The language was at war with itself. The same hit was both great and terrifying. The player was both a hard hitter and a potential danger to himself and others. This awkwardness was epitomized by the fate of the Jacked Up segment on ESPN's Monday Night Football. For years, it had been a carnival of violence. But as the concussion crisis reached fever pitch around 2012 to 2013, the segment began to feel not just outdated, but morally grotesque. The analysts hosting it, like Tom Jackson and Steve Young, found themselves in an impossible position. They were asked to celebrate the very hits that the network's own investigative unit, Outside the Lines, was exposing as causes of brain disease. The cognitive dissonance became unsustainable. The segment was first softened, then criticized internally and externally, and finally quietly retired. Its disappearance was a symbolic funeral for the most blatant form of glorification. The network didn't announce a policy change. They simply stopped doing something that had come to feel wrong. The silence where Jacked Up used to be was louder than any segment. The language around players who left games also shifted, haltingly. Where an analyst might have once said, "He's a little woozy, but he's a competitor, he'll want back in," they now began to say, "He's in the concussion protocol, and rightly so. You cannot be too careful with head injuries." The phrase concussion protocol itself entered the common broadcast vocabulary, a sterile, procedural term that carried a new implicit meaning. This is a serious medical process, not a test of manhood. The tone changed from one of expectation, "He'll shake it off," to one of caution, "His health is the priority." This was a seismic shift in narrative emphasis. The story was no longer about the player's courageous return, but about the system's duty to protect him from himself. The hero of the broadcast was no longer the player begging to go back in. It was the independent spotter in the booth who could trigger a medical evaluation. Sports writing, too, entered a period of intense self-reflection. Feature writers who had built careers on profiles of gritty warriors now had to grapple with the knowledge that the grit they admired might have been a symptom of a deadly disease. A 2014 profile of a retired enforcer could no longer just romanticize his broken nose and his painkiller use. It now had to at least acknowledge the potential cognitive toll. The archetypes began to crack under the weight of new information. The Iron Man streak was no longer just an epic of durability. It was also a potential ledger of unreported concussions. The language became more nuanced, more questioning. Verbs changed. Writers stopped saying a player shook off a hit and started saying he was evaluated for one. The adverb bravely, in front of played through injury, became less frequent, often replaced by reportedly or despite. This reckoning was, and remains, incomplete. Old habits of speech die hard. You can still hear a color commentator slip and call a violent collision a football play, or praise a defender for being physical in a way that clearly celebrates fear-inducing violence. The highlight shows still feature big hits, though the accompanying commentary is now more likely to mention fines or penalties than to pure celebration. The vocabulary change is not a purge. It is a coexistence, an ongoing tension. The old language of war and glory is still there, in the DNA of the broadcast, but it is now constantly chaperoned by the new language of risk and health. It is a conversation that has been permanently complicated. This reluctant shift in media vocabulary did not happen because sports journalists had a collective crisis of conscience. It happened because the story broke out of the sports section and became a front-page story, a legal story, a medical story, and a human tragedy story. The media's language changed when the audience's perception changed. When parents started looking at the game differently, the broadcasters had to follow. When readers demanded to know about CTE, writers had to learn the science. The economic and cultural authority of the league to control its narrative had been permanently diminished by the very journalists it once counted on as partners in myth-making. But as the traditional media struggled to find its new voice, a more direct, more powerful form of storytelling emerged. The subjects of the myth, the players themselves, decided to stop waiting for the translators. They picked up the pen and the camera, and they began to tell their own stories in their own words without filter or heroic filter. The narrative was leaving the press box for good. The media's vocabulary was changing, but it was still a translation, a filtered interpretation. The words, even the more careful ones, still belong to outsiders. For the player, the subject of this century-long story, a fundamental question remained. What if the translation was always flawed? What if the only person who could truly tell the story of the pain, the fear, the cost, and the complicated love for the game was the one who had lived it? In the second decade of the 21st century, technology provided the answer. A new platform emerged, one that allowed the player to bypass the press box entirely, to step out from behind the quoted soundbite and command the page himself. This was the era of the player as journalist. Led by ventures like the Players Tribune, retired and active players seized the narrative apparatus, not to perpetuate the old myth, but to complicate it, to humanize it, and to tell a story of football that was far more nuanced, far more painful, and far more true than any heroic profile or cinematic highlight reel had ever dared to be. The Players Tribune, founded by Derek Jeter in 2014, was the watershed. Its stated mission was to provide athletes with a platform to connect directly with their fans, in their own words. For football players, this was not merely a new publicity channel. It was an act of narrative liberation. For the first time, a player could articulate his experience without the middleman of a reporter who might twist a quote, seek conflict, or frame his pain within the old tropes of toughness. The writing that emerged from this platform was qualitatively different. It was introspective, raw, and often haunting. It moved beyond the cliches of the locker room and explored the psychological and physical landscape of a football life with a vulnerability the traditional media rarely accessed, because the traditional media was rarely trusted to handle it with care. One of the earliest and most resonant examples was Nate Jackson, a former Denver Broncos tight end. His writing for the Players Tribune and later in his memoir, Slow Getting Up, dismantled the glamorous facade of the NFL with dark humor and unflinching honesty. He wrote not as a star, but as a fringe player, describing the absurd, dehumanizing grind of life on the roster bubble. He detailed the rampant use of Toradol and Vicodin, not as a scandalous expose, but as a matter-of-fact component of the job, the maintenance required to keep the machine running. Jackson described the culture of pain management with a weary clarity. We were walking malpractice suits, but we were willing. His prose stripped away the mythology and revealed the NFL as a workplace, a beautiful, brutal, and often stupid workplace where your body was your tool, and you were encouraged to grind down its teeth to keep it cutting. This was not the language of the warrior. It was the language of the mechanic, and it was revolutionary in its plainness. Then came the stories that directly confronted the brain trauma crisis, told from the inside. In 2015, former NFL linebacker Chris Borland, who had walked away from a promising career after just one season due to concussion concerns, wrote a first-person piece explaining his decision. It was a calm, reasoned, and devastating critique. He didn't shout, he cited. He talked about the research, about the unknowns, about the cognitive risks he was no longer willing to take. His article was not the angry rant of a disgruntled ex-player. It was the sober testimony of a canary in the coal mine, explaining to the world why the air was no longer safe to breathe. Borland's piece gave intellectual heft and moral authority to the act of walking away, fundamentally challenging the quitter label that the old code would have imposed. He reframed self-preservation as wisdom. Active players began using the platform to share stories they would never tell a beat reporter. Pittsburgh Steelers linebacker James Harrison used it to post the staggering fine letters he received from the league office for violent hits, juxtaposing the league's public safety stance with its simultaneous punishment of the very style of play it had glorified for decades. It was a brilliant act of rhetorical jiu-jitsu, using the league's own paperwork to highlight its hypocrisy. Other players wrote about the mental health struggles that followed them off the field, the anxiety, the depression, the sense of purposelessness after retirement. These were not tales of glory days. They were confessions from the long, silent aftermath. The platform allowed them to connect their present suffering to their past profession in a direct, unmediated way, forging a powerful link for the public between the Sunday spectacle and the Monday morning reality. Perhaps the most profound impact of this player-driven journalism was its role in reshaping the concussion narrative from within. When a player like retired offensive lineman Kyle Turley gave a graphic, emotional video interview describing his own descent into suicidal thoughts, memory loss, and rage, and directly attributed it to football, it carried a credibility no news report could match. He was the source, the evidence, and the storyteller all in one. His pain was not a statistic. It was a first-hand account. These narratives performed a crucial function. They put a face, a voice, and a beating, damaged heart to the clinical term CTE. They transformed pathology into biography. This direct communication also changed the dynamic of the sports news cycle. When a player wanted to address a controversy, announce a retirement, or explain an injury, he no longer needed to call a press conference and risk having his message distilled into a misleading headline. He could publish a carefully crafted essay. This was empowerment, but it also presented a new challenge: curation. The Players' Tribune employed editors and ghostwriters to help athletes shape their stories. This meant the words, while in the player's voice and carrying his perspective, were often polished for public consumption. The platform was not a raw, unfiltered stream of consciousness. It was a curated form of authenticity. Yet, even with this curation, the core authenticity remained because the perspective was sovereign. The player was finally controlling the frame. The effect on the traditional media was profound. Sports writers, who had long been the gatekeepers of athletic narrative, found themselves responding to stories rather than breaking them. They were forced to analyze the player's own words instead of putting words in his mouth. This created a healthier, more respectful, and more nuanced ecosystem. The player's first-person account became the primary source, and the journalist's role shifted toward context, analysis, and investigation of the systems the player described. It leveled the playing field. The myth-making machinery, which had always relied on a separation between the subject and the storyteller, was short-circuited. The subject had taken over the controls. This seismic shift in narrative power did not end the story of football's darkness. It deepened it. It allowed for a complexity that black and white hero worship could never accommodate. A player could write a love letter to the game and a warning about its dangers in the same essay. He could express gratitude for the life it gave him and rage for the life it took from him. He could be both a proud gladiator and a wounded veteran. This nuanced, contradictory, emotionally layered truth was the gift of the player as journalist. It forced fans, the media, and the league itself to hold two opposing ideas in their minds at once. That football could be a source of profound meaning and a cause of profound damage, and that the men who played it were not archetypes, but complicated human beings making impossible calculations about their bodies and their futures. They had stopped being characters in someone else's epic and had started writing their own memoirs. But as the players found their voice and the old media structures adapted, a new frontier of storytelling emerged, one not bound by the constraints of journalism at all. It came from a place of pure narrative hunger, and it threatened to build new myths atop the rubble of the old. The players had taken up the pen. The traditional media had been chastened, its vocabulary shifting from celebration to caution. But nature abhors a narrative vacuum. Into this new, uncertain landscape surged a new generation of storytellers, armed not with press credentials or team affiliations, but with microphones, YouTube channels, and podcast feeds. This is the era of the new Mythmakers. The long-form podcast hosts, the documentary filmmakers on streaming platforms, the social media analysts with millions of followers. They promise a deeper, smarter, more authentic connection to the game than the old, corrupted media structures could provide. But a critical question hangs over their work. Are they deconstructing the century-old myth of toughness? Or are they, in the name of sophisticated analysis and inside access, building new, equally problematic myths for a more knowing audience? And what is the ethical responsibility of covering a sport whose capacity for human destruction is now an established, inescapable fact? The promise of this new media is undeniable. It offers depth and nuance that a 3-hour game broadcast or a 750-word column never could. Podcasts like The Athletic Football Show or the GM Shuffle dedicate hours to schematic analysis, salary cap intricacies, and draft evaluations. They appeal to the intellectual fan, the one who sees the game as chess, not a bar fight. This focus on strategy and front office mechanics seems, on its surface, to be a move away from the glorification of violence. It emphasizes the mind over the body. It treats football as a complex business and a tactical puzzle. This feels like progress. Similarly, the explosion of film breakdown accounts on social media, where analysts use all 22 footage to illustrate subtle technique, appears to valorize skill and intelligence over brute force. They highlight the offensive lineman's perfect footwork, not the linebacker's devastating hit. This new language of leverage, angles, and processing seems to replace the old language of punishment and physicality. Yet, within this analytical framework, a new, subtler myth can be forged, the myth of the flawless machine. This narrative, often advanced by former scouts and coaches turned media personalities, frames players less as human beings and more as functional assets in a grand strategic design. The language is that of efficiency and valuation. A running back isn't discussed in terms of his courage. He's discussed in terms of his yards after contact, a metric that still implicitly celebrates his ability to absorb punishment and continue. A wide receiver who makes catches over the middle is praised for his contested catchability, a sterile phrase that masks the reality of the safeties waiting to separate him from his senses. The violence is not celebrated poetically. It is quantified, optimized, and factored into the player's overall grade. This can be more dehumanizing than the old warrior archetype. The gladiator was at least a tragic hero. The efficient asset is just a component. The new myth becomes one of cold, corporate utility, where a player's health is a simple variable in a risk-reward algorithm, discussed with the same dispassion as a stock portfolio. Streaming documentaries, particularly those not produced by the league itself, present a more complex case. Series like Netflix's Quarterback or the FX documentary The NFL, The Epic History of America's Game have the time and budget to explore complexity. They can show the fear in a quarterback's eyes before a snap, the toll of pressure on a family, the grueling rehab from injury. They often include warnings about the sport's dangers. But they also, by their very nature as entertainment products, must craft compelling narratives. And the most compelling narratives often still rely on cores of conflict, sacrifice, and triumph over adversity, the very building blocks of the old myth. A documentary can show a player receiving a pain-killing injection and frame it as a revealing, gritty behind-the-scenes moment. But does the audience see it as a medical scandal or as proof of his dedication? The line between expose and fetishization is perilously thin. The camera intimate gaze can accidentally glorify the very suffering it seeks to document, because the suffering is what makes the eventual triumph meaningful. The ethical documentary must constantly wrestle with this. Is it making the cost so beautiful that the cost seems worth it? The most profound ethical dilemma for all these new myth makers, from the podcast host to the documentarian, is foundational. They are creating content about a sport that they now know definitively causes catastrophic brain damage in a significant percentage of its participants. How do you cover the X's and O's of a game that has O's as a pathology? How do you analyze a great hit when you know that hit may be the one that contributes to a future suicide? There is no clean answer. Some respond by ignoring the cognitive dissonance, retreating into pure football analysis as a safe space. Others make the danger a central, recurring theme of their work, which can lead to a different kind of exhaustion or performative hand-wringing. Most exist in an uncomfortable middle, issuing periodic caveats, with all that we know about the dangers of the game, before proceeding to break down the very violence that creates those dangers. This is the central, unresolvable tension of covering modern football. To analyze it is to engage with its core mechanic, which is controlled violence. To promote it is to be complicit in its consequences. This dilemma is exacerbated by the economic model of new media. Their success is measured in downloads, views, and subscriptions. Controversy and drama drive engagement. The nuanced, health-focused podcast may be righteous, but the one dissecting the latest sideline tantrum or celebrating the most violent tacklers in the league will often find a larger, more fervent audience. The algorithm rewards certainty and passion, not ambiguity and caution. This creates an incentive to create new, clear-cut narratives. This quarterback is clutch, that coach is a genius, this defense is historically nasty. These are just cleaner, data-informed versions of the old archetypes. The warrior becomes the alpha. The gladiator becomes the dog. The language updates, but the fundamental expectation of sacrificial performance remains. So, are the new Mythmakers an evolution or a repackaging? The answer is both. They have dismantled the league's monopoly on narrative and introduced a welcome era of skepticism and depth. They have given players a platform and fans an education. They have made it impossible for the sport to be viewed through a purely romantic lens. But they have not solved the core ethical problem. They are still storytellers profiting from a story that ends, for too many of its protagonists, in tragedy. Their analysis, no matter how smart, is still built upon the broken bodies of men. They are narrating a beautiful, intricate game being played on the edge of a moral cliff. The most responsible among them point out the cliff at every turn. The least responsible use it as a dramatic backdrop. But they all benefit from the game being played, from the spectacle continuing. The new Mythmakers, for all their intelligence and access, are still caught in the same fundamental bind as the old ones. Their livelihood depends on the perpetuation of the very thing they are often compelled to critique. The story is now smarter, but is it any wiser? As we near the end of this examination, we are left with the most difficult question of all. Having seen how the myth was built, brick by brick, and how it now cracks under the weight of truth, can we ever truly unlearn it? Can the culture of football, from the front office to the fan in the stands, develop a new relationship with the violence that has always been its beating, bleeding heart? The myth has been dissected. Its origins in the press box, its sermonizing by coaches, its amplification by television, its canonization in film and print, its economic enforcement, its social policing in the locker room, its medical facilitation, its devastating collision with science, and its slow, fraught rewriting by both journalists and players themselves. All of it lies before us, a mapped territory of a century-long story. But knowledge of a myth is not freedom from it. Understanding the blueprint of a prison does not dissolve its walls. The most formidable challenge now is not comprehension, but unlearning. This is the cognitive and cultural reckoning that follows the factual one. What does it mean as a fan, as a writer, as a coach, as a parent, to consciously dismantle a century of conditioning that taught us to see valor in violence and character in self-destruction? Can we watch differently? Can we report differently? And if we strip away the glorification of the hit, if we truly prioritize safety, are we left with a game that is even marketable? Or has the genie of violence been so powerfully conjured that it can never be forced back into the bottle? Unlearning begins with a fundamental, uncomfortable shift in perception. For generations, the sight of a player staggering to his feet after a crushing blow triggered a specific, conditioned response. Admiration. We saw courage. We saw toughness. We saw a gladiator rising. To unlearn is to reprogram that reaction. It is to look at that same staggering player and feel, first and foremost, a jolt of concern. To see not a warrior, but a patient. To hope not that he shakes it off, but that he is removed from the game and given a thorough neurological examination. This is an emotional rebellion against everything we have been taught. It requires sitting in a stadium or on a couch and consciously rejecting the visceral thrill of the colossal hit, or at least tempering that thrill with an immediate sense of dread. It means catching yourself when you groan because a big hit draws a penalty flag for targeting, and questioning why your entertainment is predicated on an act that could end a man's cognitive function. The fans' unlearning is a quiet, personal revolt against their own instincts, forged over a lifetime of Sundays. For the media, unlearning is a professional and linguistic dismantling. It means abandoning the last vestiges of the old vocabulary, not as a performative act, but as a moral imperative. It means the analyst in the booth must stop using toughness and playing hurt as automatic synonyms for leadership. It means the feature writer must approach the story of a player's pain not as a path to heroism, but as a potential pathway to tragedy. It requires a new framework where the most important story of a game might not be the winning touchdown, but the concussion protocol that kept a star out of the second half, and that this is framed as a story of responsible progress, not one of competitive loss. Unlearning for the media is the permanent adoption of a precautionary principle in its narrative choices. It is understanding that their words are not just describing a game. They are actively shaping the culture in which that game is played. Their silence on a dangerous hit is complicity. Their celebration of it is malpractice. For the league and its teams, unlearning is the most paradoxical struggle because it conflicts with a century of successful marketing. The NFL's entire brand identity is built on controlled chaos, on superhuman physicality, on the breathtaking collision. Can you market safety? Can you sell mitigated risk? The league attempts this tightrope walk every day. It promotes new helmet technology, strict concussion protocols, and rules against targeting, all while its highlight packages and promotional materials still inevitably feature the explosive tackle and the leaping catch over the middle where the receiver is blasted. The league is trying to unlearn its own product while still selling it. This creates a schizophrenic message. Watch these incredible, violent athletes, but don't worry, we're making it less violent. The fundamental marketability of the sport remains tied to the very thing they are now forced to pathologize. Has the genie of violence been let out of the bottle? The genie is the bottle. The violence is not an additive. It is the foundational element. To remove it entirely is to create a different sport. This leads to the agonizing core of the unlearning process, the realization that a truly safe version of professional football, as currently constructed, may be a contradiction in terms. The physics are immutable. Large, fast men colliding at high speeds will generate brain trauma. You can move the strike zone, you can penalize the head, you can improve the armor, but you cannot repeal the laws of momentum and physiology. The subconcussive hits, the thousands of minor brain jolts that linemen exchange on every play, may be the most insidious threat, and they are woven into the fabric of every snap. To unlearn the myth of toughness is to eventually confront this possibly unresolvable problem. We may be left with a choice between a game that is recognizably football but inherently dangerous, and a game that is safe but unrecognizable. The unlearning asks us, can we still love the sport if we fully, viscerally accept that it breaks the people who play it? Perhaps the most profound unlearning is happening within players, and it creates a new kind of conflict. The modern player enters the league more informed than any generation before him. He has seen the documentaries, read the articles about CTE, heard the stories of his broken predecessors. He knows, and yet he still chooses to play. This is not ignorance. It is informed consent under extreme economic and social pressure. His unlearning is different. He must unlearn the instinct to trust the institution with his health. He must become his own advocate, question the team doctor, understand the long-term implications of every injection. He must navigate the impossible tension between using his body as a weapon to keep his job and preserving that body for the 50 years of life he hopes to have after the job is gone. He must carry the cognitive dissonance that the fan only watches. His unlearning is a daily, high-stakes negotiation between his dreams, his financial reality, and his mortality. So, what is the endpoint of unlearning? It is not the end of football. The sport is culturally rooted too deeply. The unlearning is not a destination, but a permanent state of tension. It is watching the beautiful, intricate, strategic ballet while acknowledging the background rate of ruin. It is celebrating athletic genius while mourning the cost. It is holding two opposing truths in mind at once. That the game can be a source of profound meaning, identity, and joy, and that it is also a vector of disease and despair. The unlearning means the myth can never be whole again. The story is forever cracked. We can no longer watch in innocent celebration. We watch now with knowledge, with complication, with a measure of guilt, and with a critical eye. This does not ruin the game. It makes our relationship with it more adult, more responsible, and more real. The childish fantasy of the indestructible warrior is gone. In its place is the complex reality of the courageous, talented, and risk-accepting human being. The glory is dimmed, but perhaps it is more authentic. The unlearning is the price of awareness. It is the heavy lifting of moral witness. We have spent a century learning how to glorify pain. The work of the next century is to understand it, to mitigate it, and to finally, honestly account for it. This is the unfinished project. This is the legacy we must now grapple with, not as passive fans of a spectacle, but as conscious participants in a cultural story that has real human consequences. The whistle has blown on the old myth. The hard work of building a new, more honest story in its place has just begun. The echo never truly fades. It simply changes its tone. For a century, the echo in the stadium was the roar of approval, the collective affirmation of a story we told ourselves about strength, virtue, and glory. Now, the echo is different. It is the quieter, more persistent sound of a question hanging in the air after the crowd has departed. It is the question this series has sought to amplify, dissect, and finally to answer. We have traveled through the anatomy of a myth. We have seen the machinery that took the base metal of violence and alchemized it into gold. We have met the engineers, the sports writers at their typewriters, the coaches in their pulpits, the filmmakers in their editing bays, the broadcasters in their booths, the doctors in their training rooms. We have seen the product, the archetype of the gladiator sold to the public and, most devastatingly, sold to the young men who would be forced to embody it. And we have witnessed the cost, tallied not in yards or points, but in broken minds and ruined lives. The story of football's Darkside is not, in the end, a sports story. It is a story about how America builds its idols and what it demands in payment for their divinity. The myth was never a spontaneous creation. It was a collaborative enterprise, a pyramid of complicity with each layer supporting the one above. At the base, the league and its teams, the economic engine that needed a marketable product. They did not invent violence, but they perfected its packaging. They funded the films, curated the access, and when the science began to whisper warnings, they built committees not to listen, but to drown out the sound. Their responsibility is one of pure, cold prioritization. For decades, the health of the product superseded the health of the producer. The ledger was clear. Revenue was tangible. Future liability was abstract. They sold a vision of heroic warfare, all while denying the most basic casualty reports from the front lines. Upon that foundation, the media built the narrative temple. They were the poets, the priests, the amplifiers. From Grantland Rice's epic stanzas to John Facenda's godly narration to the giddy cries of Jacked Up. They provided the language, the soundtrack, and the moral framing. Their complicity was one of uncritical celebration. They confused drama with truth and spectacle with substance. They fell in love with the story they were assigned to tell, and in doing so, they failed in their primary duty, to interrogate power and speak truth. They were not passive observers. They were active mythmakers, weaving a tale of valor that made the exploitation of the body seem noble. They turned medical facts into metaphors, and in that translation, the humanity of the player was often the first thing lost. Then came the internal enforcers, the coaching priesthood and the locker room culture. They operationalized the myth. They took the abstract ideal of toughness and turned it into daily practice, a system of peer pressure and shame so effective it became self-policing. Their complicity was one of tradition and tribalism. They believed they were building character, forging men. In reality, they were often breaking them, teaching them to equate their worth with their pain tolerance, to see their body as a weapon to be spent, not a vessel to be preserved. They created a world where the ultimate betrayal was not to your own long-term health, but to the immediate needs of the group. This was the myth made flesh, its commandments written not on stone, but in the grimaces of men playing on torn ligaments and concussed brains. And what of the fans? Our complicity is the most diffuse but no less real. We were the congregation, We bought the tickets, drove the ratings, purchased the jerseys, and roared our approval at the very hits that we now know cause dementia. We demanded the spectacle. We reveled in the violence. We internalized the archetypes and judged the players by their capacity to fulfill them. We created the market for the product. Our complicity is one of willful ignorance, of choosing the compelling story over the complicated truth. We wanted heroes, not human beings. We wanted gladiators, not employees in a dangerous profession. Our love for the game was and is genuine, but for too long, it was a love that refused to see the cost, because to see it would have complicated the pleasure. This ecosystem, this pyramid of complicity, reveals the systemic issue. Football's dark side is not an anomaly. It is a feature of how American culture often constructs its ideals of manhood and value. We have a historical pattern of creating heroic narratives that require sacrifice, and then abandoning the sacrifices once they are made. We did it with the frontiersman, the soldier, the industrial worker. Football is merely the latest and most vividly televised chapter. We take young men, often from backgrounds where the sport appears as the clearest path to prestige and prosperity, and we immerse them in a value system that prizes collective triumph over individual well-being. We offer them glory, but the contract, written in invisible ink, stipulates their long-term health as the price. We build them up as idols on Sunday, and then we are often unprepared or unwilling to care for them when the idolatry ends on Monday. So, we arrive at the final, haunting question that has shadowed every frame of this series. Was the true cost ever a secret, or was it simply a story we all chose to tell wrong? The evidence suggests it was never a secret. It was an open secret, whispered in training rooms with the hiss of the analgesic spray, visible in the wobbly gait of retired players, implicit in the very language of getting your bell rung. The secret was not hidden in a vault. It was broadcast in slow motion, set to stirring music, and sold back to us as valor. We chose the wrong story because the right one was too painful, too threatening to our enjoyment, too damning to our collective self-image. The right story would have forced us to question the foundations of a cultural institution. The wrong story allowed us to keep the institution and simply mythologize its casualties. The reckoning, when it came, was not a revelation of unknown facts, but a collapse of the narrative wall that had been built to keep those facts at bay. The science of CTE did not discover a new disease. It gave a name and a pathological confirmation to a suffering that had always been there. The suicides of men like Junior So were not mysteries. They were horrific conclusions to a story of neurological decay that the football world had witnessed in slow motion for years, but refused to properly diagnose. The truth did not burst forth from hiding. It finally shouted loud enough to be heard over the decades of orchestral scores and celebratory commentary. Where does this leave us now? It leaves us in a state of fraught, complicated consciousness. The myth is cracked. We can no longer watch with innocent eyes. Every spectacular catch over the middle is now also a potential neurological event. Every lineman's collision is a subconcussive accumulation. The game is still beautiful in its strategy, breathtaking in its athleticism, and powerful in its communal appeal. But the beauty is now stained with knowledge. We watch as we must with dual vision. We see the play and we see the potential cost. We admire the skill and we fear the consequence. This is the new, uncomfortable responsibility. For the league, it means that safety cannot be a public relations campaign. It must be a genuine, overriding ethical priority, even if it dulls the spectacle's sharpest edges. For the media, it means that coverage must permanently integrate a duty of care, refusing to slip back into the easy language of glorification. For players, it means navigating their careers with a painful awareness their predecessors were denied, making informed choices in a system still rigged against their long-term interests. And for us, the fans, it means evolving from a cheering congregation into a conscientious witness. It means supporting the players not just as idols, but as human beings whose post-career lives matter. It means accepting that our entertainment has a profound moral dimension, and that our passion must now be tempered with compassion. The echo in the empty stadium is the sound of that responsibility settling in. It is the silence after the story we told ourselves has finished. Into that silence, we must now speak a new, more honest story. A story that does not ignore the darkness, but acknowledges it. A story that celebrates the athlete without demanding his ruin. A story that loves the game but not blindly. The myth of the unbreakable gladiator is over. What comes next is up to us. We have seen the dark side. We can no longer claim we do not know what it holds. The only question remaining is what we choose to do with the light of that knowledge. The final whistle on the old way of thinking has blown. The game of understanding what we have been a part of and what we must become is just beginning.